from just outside the Empire City at the crossroads to the northeast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, this is your premier podcast for all things unknown, not media, and I'm your host, JP. Welcome to Not Media, and again, by popular demand, I have my very good friend Jesse on this afternoon, and we will be diving into a review and a breakdown of a book that Jesse had put me onto under the title of Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1, and that's the title of the book, and I guess the subtitle would be The Sordid Union Between Intelligence and Crime That Gave Rise to Jeffrey Epstein, Volume 1. So I guess there's going to be, with the since this is Volume 1, I believe there's going to be a second volume to this book. We didn't get into that. So for anybody listening, we're not claiming to be experts on all of the information. We're just trying to break down this book a little bit. There is a lot of information inside this book. So for anybody to claim that they're an expert after just reading one book or, on something, there's a lot of information here. So I think it's will be helpful to have Jesse here. And he is very, very good at reading and very good at breaking things down, being a English teacher and just having a history and a passion for reading. And, he has a good eye and a good mind to be able to break things down in a concise manner, because this book can be very confusing. And other than that, how are you doing this afternoon, Jesse? Thanks for coming on Not Media.
Doing great. Glad to be here with you guys again, looking into another book. And I'm excited to talk about this one. There's a lot here, and hopefully we can, help people who are interested in the book kind of be able to approach it in a way to make it more manageable, like you said.
Excellent. And how's your summer coming along? I know, being a teacher, that you get a little bit of your summer off. Did that give you maybe a little bit more time to look into something like this a little deeper? Because this book is definitely information dense. I would say that's a nice way to put it. There's a lot going on in this book.
It's been a summer of it's been relaxing, but it's also been a lot of reading, which I love. And I've been reading primarily history books this summer, which usually I have a mix of fiction and history, but this summer it's been really nonfiction heavy. But it's been perfect to kind of help me contextualize this book in some ways, because I read a history of World War I called Pandora's Box, and it was highly engaging, really interesting book. Totally recommend it to anybody interested in World War I history. And of course, I was reading this book, and then I've been reading, I'm not done with it yet, a book called Blood and Runes, which is a history of World War II. So it's funny because a lot of what goes on in this book is based out of that time period, and it helped me kind of contextualize, put things in order a little bit better and get a clearer picture. So good summer, learning a lot and reading a lot, which I love to do, and just enjoying my last few weeks before we get back to the grind.
Yeah, oh yeah, I know. I've taken a little hiatus from this podcast. Reason being is, I think I mentioned this before on the podcast. I'm not even sure. I've been so busy, but I'm getting my master's degree in clinical mental health, so I've kind of maybe given this podcast a little bit of a backseat in my life. Not that I've given up on it. I've just kind of, obviously with college, taking out loans to go back to college and trying to get my master's degree, I'm trying to take that serious. I'm not trying to, take that not serious after still working full-time in law enforcement. So I'm trying to juggle those two things and, try to keep up with that schedule. And luckily I'm able to, once in a while get an episode of this podcast in. So it's great to have you on. One thing I didn't mention, I didn't really look too much up about the author. I'm not too familiar with her. Her name is Whitney Alyse Webb, and she's the one who wrote this book. And, she did a very good job, as you and I got a little chance to speak beforehand about, you had said you were able to look into some of the citations, which there is a lot of in this book. And she definitely did her homework, it sounds like. So she's definitely did an excellent job at being able to pick and pull information from different sources and come together with this very dense history of how there is a history before Jeffrey Epstein of corruption in the world of intelligence crossing with the world of crime and the world of and banking. There's this almost like nexus of corruption that there is a history of in this country, and a lot of it, it's some of these intelligence agencies trying to fight communism. There's a lot of reasons why this was going on, and they couldn't necessarily come forward up front with the public and talk about that they needed to do this. It's almost kind of like, I don't know, like making a deal with the devil, like in order so they can get what they needed to get done, to finish their main objective. But I didn't really get a chance to look too much into the author. Are you familiar with any of her other work, or just as far as who she is? As a journalist, investigative journalist?
Yeah, well, I don't. From what I've read about her background, she seems to kind of be an independent sort of writer, investigative journalist. She doesn't have too much like a formal background, which is, I think you're seeing more and more of that nowadays, where it's not like, oh, I worked for the New York Times for 15 years. And she's kind of like someone who kind of just rose up, I think, in the world of independent writing online, as well as she's worked for some other websites. And now I think she has her own podcast, and I see her a lot now. I've listened to her in a few interviews in some of the bigger podcasts out there. So her name is really starting to come to the forefront. I mean, people in the world of podcasting from Carlson have mentioned her. Other folks have mentioned her in the podcasting world. So he's definitely making a stir, and I think she's going to just get bigger as the years go on.
Good. It's good to see that these sorts of figures are getting more popular with the world of podcasting. These independent type of journalists, which once upon a time probably would have had a very small platform, and it would have been very hard for them to break into the mainstream, because it almost seems like there's just as this is from an outside looking in perspective. I don't really know, because I'm not a journalist. I mean, being a podcaster doesn't necessarily make me a journalist. But it seems like that the world of media, and that's one of the reasons why I started Not Media, is because it sickened me. And it was mostly when I was doing my research about the paranormal and like the UFO world, and how much the mainstream media would always be pouring water all over it, and then you get to read a whole book. You're like, well, I just read a whole book, like 400-page book that says exactly the opposite in 100 different ways of what this mainstream media. So I got sick of the mainstream media. So it's good to see other independent journalists. This isn't my area of expertise, so I'm glad to have you here. And I'm grateful for the great recommendation for this book. But it seems like I'm happy that independent journalists are able to get a little bit more of a platform, and have started getting a little bit notoriety more so they can have their voices heard about things that have been going on that have probably been the mainstream media has probably been bought and paid for by the world of intelligence for things that I know. Like an example was, I read a book by a UFO researcher named Richard Dolan, and it was about somebody that was fronting the National Enquirer at the time, and there was a connection between the National Enquirer, and there was a connection between the world of intelligence, and it was a lot of times like, at the time. I think his name was Gene Pope, I believe, the person who was the editor of the National Enquirer. This is just from memory, and this is years back, but I believe his name was Gene Pope. And somehow there was a connection between the world of national intelligence and the National Enquirer, and it would be like if they wanted to pour water on a story. Through the back channels, they would feed a story to the National Enquirer. So if something happened, let's say like in the world at the time, like in the world of UFO, they would say like, oh, well, there is some truth to this. We don't want this to get out. Let's call up our buddies at the National Enquirer. I think we can. They'll handle this real quick. So when all the moms and pops are at the, they're hanging out at the grocery store Sunday morning buying milk and eggs for their Sunday brunch, they're going to see like, four-headed alien has a baby with a human being, and you're like, oh God, what is this junk? Why do people pay money for this junk? And that's what everybody's thinking. So anything to do with the National Enquirer is automatically considered just absolute garbage. And there's some method to that madness, because then it would open up the world of intelligence to be able to through back channels feed real stories to the National Enquirer and say, well, if it was in the pages of the National Enquirer, you could almost be certain it's absolutely nonsense. Oh, come on, you can't take this serious. So that's just one example. But I'm just saying, I'm sure there's there's many, many, many other examples. That's just one I happen to know about for years back doing.
No, I think it's a great example. Funny enough, this all goes back to Jeffrey Epstein, right? He's on the cover of the book, and Ghislaine Maxwell, who we know was his former girlfriend, his close confidant, who was part of this web of sex trafficking that she's in prison for right now. Her father, Robert Maxwell, that's exactly what he was. He was a media tycoon in Britain, and he worked for different intelligence agencies and used his media platforms to feed propaganda as they needed it fed to the average consumer.
Wow.
So case in point, it all comes back around to that.
Yeah. It's powerful to know that if you can control the flow of intelligence, you could really control people, or at least control their thoughts and their minds. I forget what the quote was. I think we had brought this up on one of my last episodes, but it was a really good quote from a book I read, and it was like, the illiterate of the modern day is not anymore those who can't read. Because everybody has access to like a smartphone or whatever. Everybody, the ability to be able to read is so much more available to everybody just because of the access to books and smartphones. I mean, anybody could download an app to help them, assist them to learn how to read. So, it's not so much it's almost like the illiterate of today is those who aren't able to process information or are fed incorrect information and then, just believe the lies. So like that's the game that we are here in 2025. And I guess we even saw a little bit of this throughout with the shutdown with COVID. We started seeing like censorship getting ramped up on these I would say more like left-run websites or like left-sponsored websites, but it's just an example. I'm not trying to call out any a political party. I just noticed that like certain websites that would be like they would start saying like this was fact-checked. They would have to start fact-checking everything, and then other people would say, well, this is an opinion from this party. This is not necessarily a fact. Or they say, no, well, this is fact. So it became an argument of like, well, what's a fact then? If you're saying that no, this person came forward and they said they worked for this organization and they say this is real, and you're like, well, we fact-checked that, and we're gonna have to put a flag on your information. So there was this game going on, and I've never seen this before up until like the shutdown with COVID, and I think it was a lot of it started surrounding information about COVID, but then we saw censorship. And I even with this podcast, I noticed that sometimes I would do an episode on YouTube, and I'm going to call YouTube as being one of these sites, and they started like flagging my videos. Like, for example, like I had a guest on, Norio Hayakawa, I believe his name was. This is, again, off of my memory. He is a UFO researcher, and I think it was like episode 6 or 7. This is a couple years back now. And he was talking about Area 51 and his expertise of being a UFO researcher with Area 51. We started talking about facts and figures, and I started talking about like some other examples of things going on and maybe whistleblowers that were coming out. And automatically, I didn't ask YouTube to do this. They put a link in right under my video, like, hi, this is a true history of Area 51. And then I clicked on that website, and it went directly to like it wasn't Wikipedia. It was like, it had an official sounding name, like somethingpedia. And you're like, oh, well, it's somethingpedia. It's like an encyclopedia. It must be official. It must be like scholars who like write this website. And then I clicked on a link on that website, and it went automatically to like a whole article on one of the whistleblowers, which is one of the, the hotly debated topics of, Jeremy Corbell, and did a documentary on this guy named Bob Lazar, who over the years has been talked about as a figure that was actually completely bunk, but recently he was vindicated in a documentary that Jeremy Corbell did, where a lot of his facts and the things that he was talking about Area 51 checking out and stuff doing to do with UFO research there. But I just said, okay, so I had freedom of speech. I did a podcast on this episode, and I talked about this topic. YouTube stepped in without me asking them to step in and forced a link on my page, which in a roundabout ways is censorship. And I remember that making me really angry. I'm like, well, here's 5 hours of my research or 10 or 20 hours of my research, and this is what I came up with. And YouTube basically stepped in and like politely went like, like, well, if you want the true history about what this gentleman's talking about, click this link. And like the true history, what they gave you was exactly the opposite what I was sponsoring on that video. So like that censorship, you know, and like we do see this now. We do see this with, you know, certain websites, and that's why I like websites like Rumble. I post my video to Rumble because they do less censorship there. And without going into any more of a backdrop of like the things surrounding censorship and such, circling back around to this book does not, and let's just make this clear, this book does not get into Jeffrey Epstein and necessarily his contacts. I mean, just from what I read with all the information packed in this book, this is correct. No, like this book didn't really get into, this laid the groundwork. So for anybody that's listening that thinks, oh, this is gonna be this tell-all be-all about Jeffrey Epstein, exactly, because, you know, I've had, I would say, you know, superficial interest just because of everything that we've heard about. You know, that meme that was going around a couple of years back that Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. That meme was everywhere. It was one of the biggest memes on the internet, the Jeffrey Epstein meme. So even if you don't know about Jeffrey Epstein, you know his name, and the reason why you know his name is because he was, you know, somebody who purportedly killed himself after being involved in this basically high class prostitution ring that involved very high level people, and that's the way to sum it up. So just, you know, what your thoughts are. This book did not get into that. This book lays the groundwork for how a figure like Jeffrey Epstein could exist in this world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point. I know the first time I got this book, I had it on Audible the first time I was listening to it while I was commuting to work. As I'm listening to it, I'm like, when the hell is this book going to get into Jeffrey Epstein? And I was starting to get annoyed, but then I had to pause for a second and understand the bigger point she's trying to make is that to really understand and be able to prove what Jeffrey Epstein might have been, I have to give you this back information to make, because otherwise she's going to just be throwing out names and connections and different occurrences that she's using to support her points about Epstein, probably in volume 2, that the audience is not going to get unless she, like you said, lays the groundwork, the backstory of what led up to it. So you have to you have to approach it with that mindset. And then I think that will help you kind of brace yourself to what to expect and not get frustrated where, you know, where is Epstein in all this?
Got it. Okay, so volume 2 did not come out yet, just to make that clear. I'm not sure. I don't know.
No, it's been out. It's been out.
Okay,
I haven't read it yet. That's next on my to-do list. But, you know, that one is supposed to be, from what I've heard her say, all about what Epstein was up to.
Okay, so you know, let's see how this goes. We'll try what we'll do per, you know, what I discussed with you before you had come on the podcast. We said, you know, using your expertise as someone who's a avid reader, somebody who's an English teacher, somebody that knows how to read a story and knows how to pick key points of a story apart. For somebody doesn't have that strong skill set like myself, you know, like I've always been a super strong science and math guy, but I've struggled in my life with English and like heavily dense reading subjects. Like it's just always been a struggle of mine. It's just, you know, everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. And I noticed right away what you said with this book. Like I listened to the Audible version. I tried to skim through it again for notes. Lots of names mentioned, lots and lots and lots and lots of names, lots of organizations, lots of connections, lots of doubling back around, have referenced chapter 3 to chapter 7, and then if you've paid attention to chapter 2, it's going to be in chapter 11, and it gets very confusing very quickly, you know, and I think anybody like me, and even for the years I've worked almost a decade in policing, you know, we always try to break down police reports, and this was one of the things I struggled with when I started being a police officer. Keep it simple, keep it to the point. On such and such date, at such and such time, this person had an argument with this person over this topic. Said person 1 started fighting with said person 2. At that point, he smashed a glass or broke his screen window. You know, like keep it straight: who, what, where, when, why. You know, if we can answer why, but who, what, where, when at least. And, you know, just straight and to the point. And a book like this seems to be, you know, from the unaided eye, it seems to be like it could be kind of like all over the place as far as like making connections here and there and back around again. And there's a lot of names mentioned, and a lot of, if people aren't familiar with these names and connections and businesses, you can easily get lost. It's like, it's going to be hard to see the forest through the trees. You start looking at the trees, and you're like, oh, well, wait a second. How the hell does this add up to a forest? You know, like I don't even know. Like I don't even understand, you know, like the single parts of this. So you gave me a outline, which is great. And we're going to kind of break that down. You've taken key points from this book that lay down the background foundation for how a figure like Jeffrey Epstein could come about. And you've taken, using your expertise, key points from this book that you believe bolster the argument of Whitney Webb without making it confusing, because we're not going to go over everything, and we don't have the time to go over everything, but each chapter of this book could be its own book, basically. So we're just going to go over key points throughout the book which bolster the argument for why and how the world of intelligence maybe was in bed at points with the world of organized crime and corrupt banks, and how that started. And kind of just jumping into this, you kind of had mentioned Operation Underworld, which was, part of Operation Underworld was having organized crime. I guess we would consider him like a gangster from, earlier in the 20th century, Lucky Luciano. And he would make deals from behind prison bars with the precursor of the CIA, which was the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. I believe the CIA, just off the top of my head, somewhere I think in 47 or 48 was this. Somewhere in the late 1940s, this CIA, the OSS, was then basically. I don't know if it was, I think the word disbanded, maybe a new organization called the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is what we know as the intelligence agency that we still have today operating in the United States. But before that, we had the OSS, and I guess there were a couple different angles of how Lucky Luciano was working with the OSS, and helping, actually. I believe he was helping the Navy with there was a couple different operations under Operation Underworld. I think Operation Underworld was the OSS was fearing potential access sabotage, so they used Luciano, who had a good stronghold on the labor unions that worked the docks, and this is what the gangsters of the early 20th century did, like the longshoremen and all the unions that were like considered like at the time getting extorted, and organized crime was in there, so the Navy looked to Luciano because he had such a stronghold on these dock workers. So he worked with another gangster named Meyer Lansky. They agreed to ensure the safety of the harbors and prevent strikes. So they had the power and the influence to help the Navy out. And there was another operation called Operation Husky, and Luciano, from behind bars, was able to work with the Sicilian mafia to figure out and get details on the coastlines of Sicily. So when the Allied forces, were going to put ships there and invade there, they could anticipate less resistance if they had some backdrop and some inside information. I guess it's debatable per the book, but there was a couple other things that happened. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, and how Operation Underworld was maybe some sort of a beginning to how this groundwork for corruption began between intelligence agencies and organized crime.
Yeah, you definitely touched on where it all began with the start of Operation Underworld, Luciano's power hold. I think what's really the starting example is what happened in Sicily, because this becomes a pattern that our intelligence agencies begin to see works. And what they realized was, if we can, in a lot of these kind of third world countries, if we're trying to fight a communist opponent, or we're trying to get rid of a fascist opponent out of the country, if we align ourselves with the organized crime networks that run the underworld of that nation, we can kind of coordinate with them as a way to undermine our enemies. And that's exactly what they did in Sicily, right? You had the fascists that were in there at the time. The Mussolini had made a huge effort to push out and imprison all of the Sicilian mob, and you had hundreds of former mob members that were imprisoned at this time. And it was actually a friend of Luciano's that he had saved. The guy was originally from Sicily. He came to the U.S. He ended up shooting a police chief and was arrested. Pretty much was going to serve the rest of his life in prison. Luciano helped him escape out of prison and return back to Sicily. So as a favor back to Luciano, he was going to allow this communication to happen between the U.S. military and intelligence and underground mobsters, because obviously authority figures would be the last people they'd want to talk to. But because he had the credibility with this guy who he helped years back, he was able to make that connection. So the U.S. comes in, they help the U.S. In fact, our U.S. government ends up providing weapons to them. Of course, there was this kind of, quid pro quo. Yeah, we'll help you guys get into Sicily and get the fascists out, but what are you going to do for us? And so they end up giving weapons to these mobsters, and they work in coordination with the U.S. government to take out some of the fascist military that are in Sicily, to help blow up bridges or roads that would help in kind of sabotaging their counteroffensive to the U.S. coming in. And ultimately, the crazy as it might sound, once they released all these mobsters out of the prisons, they all get released, and many of these guys end up becoming appointed the mayors and high political officials in Sicily.
Wow.
So it's like this ironic twist that happens in the end where by helping them, they got empowered.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, Luciano pretty much gets let out of prison and gets deported back to Sicily as a result of his helping the U.S. government in World War II.
Yeah. And then would you say that Luciano's original, the impetus for his original reason why he would why work, because he was already in trouble with the government here, and they were saying like, hey, one hand washes the other. You can help us out. We can help you out. Right. I mean, is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't, there might have been a tinge of patriotism, but at the end of the day, Luciano was a cold cut businessman.
Yeah.
So it wasn't out of any altruism. It was certainly out of pulling the strings to get his way eventually out of prison.
This is business, and he looked at it as business. So, obviously, if the public found out about something like this was going on at the time, there'd be a huge outcry, because now you're saying, all right, well, where's the line for morals? Yeah, we want to get the job done, but, it's like, like I had originally said, like the old saying of making a deal with the devil, like at what cost? I mean, you're buying these guns for these gangsters. People are getting murdered with these guns, and I guess on some level, maybe the world of intelligence says, well, if it's criminals killing criminals, like there's some way that somebody had to justify the morals behind doing this. And they're saying, well, is this one of the only options that we have, or is this one of the most viable options that we have? All is fair in love and war. And if there's no, at the time, I don't know what the laws were like what would have actually said that this was, whatever they were doing was illegal, to say, like during time of war, or during the time that there's going to be a war, is doing something like this considered illegal, or is it helping, is it just furthering your cause? Because at the end of the day, if the other team wins, then your country might be defeated, which could ultimately mean the deaths of millions of people. You just never know how that could turn out. So at what level the justification, was, how high this one up into the government, like is, the CIA or the OSS knows, does the president know? I mean, I would imagine that there could be, at the time of the OSS, if that was the Office of Strategic Services, that if they're involved, that mean at some level, high level politicians are involved, knowing at least what's going on here, right? I mean,
this was far from a covert operation.
Okay.
I mean, this was a military operation. This was Patton.
Okay.
The great General Patton. He was the one who went into Sicily,
so they were
with
involved.
his troops.
Got it.
So this was known all the way to the top, to the president in this particular instance.
Okay.
But what I think it did was it kind of began to lay a blueprint for this very fledgling intelligence agency of like, okay, how do we undermine and get rid of our enemies?
Okay.
And this Operation Underworld in Sicily, I think, was the beginning of saying this works. It worked for us in World War II.
Okay.
How can we use this pattern again and again?
Okay. And then I saw somewhere in the same section of the book where these operations were being discussed, and I had talked about that secondary Operation Husky, which Luciano's contacts within the Sicilian mafia. I think that's what it was dubbed, Operation Husky. And then there were other facts mentioned and figures mentioned about, an agent of the OSS, George White. He was operating, or he was recruited by another. I don't know if this is an agent, but Sidney Gottlieb, to do an experiment with unsuspecting parties. If Gottlieb was maybe the chemist, or this is at the beginning of LSD, and then they were saying that, like, this was the beginning of the idea of MK Ultra, which a lot of people know as the mind control programs. They were using CIA run safe houses. This was also mentioned somewhere around the same area of the book, where there was started to be this this line being crossed with what the CIA could do or would do. They were using safe houses and using two-way mirrors in these safe houses. This is probably moving forward more towards like the Cold War, I would imagine. Like this MK Ultra and such. But it was right around the same area of that book they started mentioning how the CIA was OSS members were working with maybe like chemists, and then started to have the idea to like coerce, people using two-way mirrors and drug experimentation unbeknownst to people's knowledge. There started to be that sort of, these sort of operations being done. And is this?
Yeah, I think, and in fact, if I remember correctly, part of those LSD experiments in these, what they would call flop houses, right? They were places where prostitutes were, that they had to coordinate with organized crime, right?
Yeah.
Who was running the prostitution rings? It was organized crime. So it was like, hey, we need to use your place. You help us out here. We'll help you out. And, it's a constant quid pro quo on, if there's an objective we have, how can the underworld help us in some way to get that? But then there's always the kickback, which is looking the other way, not prosecuting. It goes down this kind of snowball effect of how far along you go, because once you make that deal with the devil, there's always a price to be paid at the end.
Yeah. So this could be what we're talking about now, obviously with MK Ultra. These were top secret projects where we can kind of see how something a little bit more official and out in the open as Operation Underworld kind of led into, like, as maybe like the Cold War started into like unofficial top secret projects where, maybe they're not going to be talking. I believe MK Ultra, this wasn't something that was a public thing known about for decades. I believe that, these unsuspecting people were getting doped with drugs, and then they were, using, like you said, these flop houses. They were using prostitution to see how they would react to the drug. Not only that, and also, maybe to start kind of having something to hold over somebody's head, and
well, right. It's a great way to start setting up. You're absolutely right. It makes you wonder how much of this was mind control, how much of this was beginning to experiment with setting up blackmail operations.
Yeah. So
it does tie into that as well, for sure.
What is this? Is this some of the things that we were talking about with, like, I think they talked about something called the super mob. Is that maybe like the beginning of something, like these key elements of, the book had mentioned something about that, like, is that the beginning of, what the terms like the super mob was how this was, intelligence was, working with organized crime members, secretly, or, like shadowy operations?
I believe so. Yeah, it starts to get very gray, right? Like, you have a lot of these guys who are no longer CIA operatives. They go into after they leave the CIA, they retire and they go into the world of, consulting. And suddenly, what are your services good for? And they start working as private investigators. They start working as, they have the ins and outs and contacts now around the globe. And some of them go down the path of joining the kind of folks they were trying to capture with the CIA, and creating this kind of super network of criminals, former intelligence agents that they know, not just in the CIA. They have contacts with intelligence agents all over the world, can use those contacts to help execute different illegal operations unlike anybody else could.
Okay. So during the Cold War, moving kind of into the Cold War, I know it was referenced to in this book, according to Peter Dale Scott from Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, which was a book that he wrote, something that he dubbed Operation X during the Cold War, which bolstered Cold War propaganda, and it helped certain individuals and organizations work with Western intelligence services, these post-war kind of mob contacts, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was in existence from 1930 to 1968, and how maybe some of these individuals, worked with the, with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and, Operation X. Had a lot of like counterintelligence and, there was like a hidden agenda ultimately to go after communism, but they were using any means necessary with the China lobby. I guess that was the KMT, which was the Kuomintang. Is that how to pronounce it? Kuomintang? Or the Chinese
That's how I would pronounce it. Yeah, the Kuomintang.
The nationalist Chinese. I know they were big in opium. They started getting during the time of the Vietnam War. They were big into opium production out there in what was that, Southeast Asia, and they that would be what how the China lobby comes about. You want to start discussing that? Maybe this this group of or the China lobby were this domestic political pressure that supported the KMT and like hardline Cold War politics. And it was a network of politicians, businessmen, other players who lobbied in support for the KMT, as one of the only viable groups who opposed the Chinese communists. And like I said, my understanding is the KMT were one of the big was one of the big parties that were in the opium trade. So this is just an idea of who this China lobby is supporting in order to get at the communists. Do you have any comment on, Cold War era and China lobby and how, these groups came about and what their purpose was?
Yeah, I would. So the Webb goes back a little bit, and it's really interesting to see where the Kuomintang originates out of. So you got to go back. So she gives a little backstory about this organized crime group in China called the Green Gang. And the Green Gang was originally, before it became this organized crime gang, it was actually they were called long boatsmen. And the boatsmen, they handled, the importing and exporting of different materials onto the coast of China. They were legitimate workers. They also followed a religion called Luoism, something to that effect. It was they called it a folk religion. She refers to it. It was kind of a splinter from a splinter religion off of Buddhism. So they followed this religion. I guess they all kind of adhered to that as a community. But eventually, this particular religion started to become too powerful in the eyes of the Chinese government at the time. So they wanted to suppress it.
Okay.
So this kind of forced the boatmen and the follower of Luoism into kind of an underground. And to survive, they started to take their former legitimate services and started getting involved in smuggling. And so they're smuggling into China and out of China drugs and other things that were illegal. And then ultimately they consolidated as one strong organized crime unit that eventually got called the Green Gang. So the Green Gang has been around in China. I don't know if it still is to this day, but it's going back to a little bit after the 1700s. But fast forward to the 1930s, 40s, where there's a civil war going on in China between the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists came. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the nationalist military. And his rise to power, and a lot of the nationalists themselves, like you had mentioned, were being supported through the opium trade. And who ran the opium trade? The Green Gang. So the Green Gang was in support of the nationalists. They were funding and helping to support the nationalists in that way. In fact, on a little side note, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was his grandfather, I believe his name was Warren Delano. he made his money as an opium smuggler into and out of China during the 1800s.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah.
Um,
That's kind
a
of
lot of the
similar.
opium,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of the opium that he smuggled out was actually given to, I think, the Union soldiers as an anesthetic during the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
But so he makes his money as an opium trader, but eventually in the early 1900s, you have something called the Rockefeller Foundation. We all know who the Rockefellers are, right? Major, wealthy, powerful people
Yeah.
out of America. So the Rockefeller Center Foundation was set up in China to help. Their claim was that they were there to help support modernize China's medical industries. But
Okay.
inevitably, there comes the mix into the medical world. Opium is still being used as an anesthetic
Yeah.
and other legitimate medical uses, but of course also illegal medical uses. So it kind of begins to get tied in with the opium trade, this Rockefeller Foundation,
Oh,
and the organized crime of China.
wow.
So you're talking about, so you have like kind of a lot of different US business interests that were tied into China at the time, who of course didn't want the communists to come in and push them out. So there was a lot of there was a lot of money at stake. If you kicked out the nationalists, you were also kicking out all these other business interests of the United States that were going back to the 1800s. So the China lobby becomes partly a CIA backed as well as a business elites who had connections to China. And you have obviously politicians, and they were all trying to get money to lobby Congress to continue to support the Kuomintang.
Okay.
But the Kuomintang get pushed out of China about 1949. So they're pushed out into Taiwan. We know today Taiwan is still like the last vestige of former, I guess you could say, Chinese nationalism. Taiwan is still an independent democratic country, but it's an island off the coast of China. And that's where Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were kind of pushed out as well. They were pushed into parts of Burma,
Okay.
which is today Myanmar. So they're kind of outside in these two locations, and the CIA wants to help them. The China lobby wants to help them to be able to get back into China and hopefully do a counterattack.
Okay.
So this is where Operation Paper comes into play. This is the CIA operation to fund and support the nationalists in their effort to get back onto the mainland and to fight Mao Zedong and the communists and get them out of China.
Okay, excellent. Operation Paper 1951. It was the CIA's Burma, Thailand support for the KMT. A man named William Byrd, they called him Mr. Opium, was an architect of this operation, and controlled the opium supplies and to CIA assets during the Cold War, and the money was used for arms to flow to Thailand and Burma. And another figure that came up multiple times in this book, Paul Helliwell, operated a couple corrupt businesses that skated the lines of working with organized crime. I believe he was Paul Helliwell, I looked him up real quick. He was a former OSS officer, I believe. And then I think he became the head of a couple companies. One was called the Sea Supply Company. He would use to ship these guns, World Commerce Corporation. And he was also the president of Castle Trust and Bank. And according to Peter Dale Scott, this was a key point for the U.S. intelligence agency to become involved with the world drug trade. So looking, kind of segueing into that, you had brought up Operation Paper in 1951, and I mentioned how Helliwell, was the president of Castle Bank. Castle Bank had accounts for, it was a bank known for having accounts for many members of organized crime, suspects of organized crime. Just some of the listed names were Morris Kleinman, Sam Tucker, Lou Rothkopf, as well as parts of Cleveland mob scene, including Mole Dalitz. They all held money at Castle Bank. George Palmer, who was a major producer of LSD, mescaline, THC, And there were other banks that skirted with Castle Bank, such as HMT, Florida Shares, Maritime Banks. The quote from one of these books was, it was a daisy chain of offshore banks connected to Castle Bank. You know, when they talk about offshore money and laundering money, Meyer Lansky, who was well known in the world of organized crime, used money, casino money. He would skim off of casinos and launder it through Castle Bank. So, you know, and then we also know that, quoting that Hallowell was the president of Castle Bank. They also used, CIA used this for operations against Cuba. So this is one of the ways we start to see how, like, where does this money come from? How does it flow? And then how could we get a seemingly legit institution from the outside looking in, maybe to not someone who's an auditor, you know, to move money around the world in ways that it could be used. Do you have any more comments on Castle Bank and maybe some of the banks surrounding Castle Bank and how these institutions were set up?
Well, I think you bring us, this is super important, I think, for people to understand who are trying that. I think Whitney Webb is highlighting here a key point to understanding what was the purpose of Epstein. And I don't know for a fact, 'cause I haven't read volume 2, but I'm guessing that Epstein is involved in what Castle Bank is doing a lot. I think he was probably involved because he had a background from Bear Stearns, where he worked for a number of years, being the guy who helped with offshore banking. He was helping doing what Castle Bank does, which is, if the CIA wants to run an operation and they need more money for it, they have to get it approved by Congress. But if they know that the operation that they want to run is potentially, potentially has issues of ethics and corruption, and they don't want to have to work by the limitations of the codes that Congress might impose on them, or they might not just get the money at all, the CIA has to come up with creative ways to get this money. So these front banks become a way for them to be able to get money and be able to ship it and move it around without Congress knowing. So in some way, it's a way of really undermining our democracy, right? Our tax money goes to Congress.
Yep.
They decide how that money is delegated. And yet here's chunks of money that, if they can't get the money through taxes, they're going to just go kind of rogue and find other ways to get this money through their working with organized crime.
Yeah.
And so Castle Bank is a great example of that. And one way I think they do this, these, and they're not the only ones, CIA and other intelligence agencies around the globe have to do this, because they're not going to always get the money that they want for the different operations they want to run. I mean, Iran-Contra is an example of that, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, Castle Bank is a way that you can say, hey guys, at organized crime, you want me to take your money because you're making it in an illegal ways, and you need to legitimize it, money laundering. We can help.
Yeah.
We'll have you give us your money. We'll put it through our Castle Bank, our little front bank,
Yep.
and then we'll hand the money back out as a legitimate loan, which no one's ever going to pay back. So it's a way of cleaning and legitimizing money that's coming from corrupt and illegal sources. It's a super key element to not just organized crime, but to different countries that might be considered international terrorist organizations, or might be considered like pariahs in the international community.
Yeah.
How are they getting their money? How are they getting their weapons? They're cleaning it through money laundering. And these front banks like Castle Bank are key to this. But, in a lot of ways, the CIA was able to get Castle Bank out of all this trouble because the IRS investigates Castle Bank, and they're under this massive tax evasion investigation. But in 1977, the whole thing is dropped by the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
And so...
Something funny. Yeah, something funny's going on, Like nothing to see here, folks. I'm not familiar with...
Well, right. I mean, you go back to Epstein, it's like, why are, suddenly you find out that the CIA was doing something they shouldn't have been doing. I think this is my theory. The CIA is found, I think first the Department of Justice goes after something. They see some illegal activity. They look into it. They start to prosecute people, but all of a sudden they're digging into the situation. They find out that actually our own intelligence agencies have been involved in this operation. And if you prosecute the people that we found, you're also going to have to go after our own intelligence.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
then the whole operation becomes compromised, and then we're just going to sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, which then also, if you think about it, becomes a strong motive for why so many people were saying, I don't really know the ins and outs. I'm not an expert on Jeffrey Epstein, but like the whole meme that was going on for so long on the internet, it was like the number one meme, and yada, yada, yada. Here's a fact about life. And by the way, Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. Like, why so many people think that, there might have been a strong, very strong, and I'm sure, if you look more into it, that there, with all the heavy hitters and the power players that may have been involved in this, high prostitution ring skirting the lines with intelligence agencies, there certainly probably was a strong motive that you wouldn't want this guy talking if he was going to get put on the stand. And then if he did, it's going to be just a list of names that are going to have to get spilled, and then they're going to look more into it. The more they look into it, the more corruption, and there's a possibility for an active operation, or for something that is still actively going on that they still want to keep going, that you could say that this guy has become basically a loose link in this chain that we cannot have violated right now, and we have to get rid of it. We have to get rid of the loose link. So you can see the motive why there would be to get rid of somebody like a Jeffrey Epstein. Certainly, if he was involved in this an intelligence operation, this wasn't just some sort of corrupt person making money off of a high-priced prostitution ring. That there was more to this story, and there would be motives to have this guy silenced for sure. You could see that then for sure. Then, right?
Absolutely. I mean, look where he's based out of. Castle Bank, where is it based? The Bahamas. Where was Epstein Island based out of?
Yeah.
That area of the Caribbean. Those are areas where they have very little banking regulation.
Yes.
So whenever you start seeing people based out of the Caribbean and different banking and money, hedge funds or whatever it might be, you're right. As I've learned through my own research on this, you certainly, red flags should be coming up.
For sure.
People purposely kind of funnel their money through those areas to evade taxes, to launder money. That's what they're useful for.
Yeah. One of the locations for Castleback, Andros Island. I'm not sure if you're familiar with. Is that somewhere down the? They're saying that was one of the places that they might have been operating out of. This Castle Bank financing a series of covert forays, this is quoted from the book, between 1964 and 1975 against Cuba by CIA operatives working from Andros Island. So this is the Bahamas. Andros Island is located in the Bahamas. It's the largest island in the Bahamas. It's 25 miles west of New Providence Island. So, yeah. So this is, again, like you just had mentioned, this kind of puts that right in the middle of where you would find these low regulation, corrupt type of banks that, working with our intelligence and organized crime. Moving into how this kind of fits in with this connection between organized crime and intelligence communities into the Zionist movement in Palestine. There was a group called the WZO, or the World Zionist Organization, in 1970, and it was a set up outpost in Palestine of communal outposts and defense groups, and this was being supported. And a man named Yehuda Arazi, with the help of a successful businessman from the United States, I believe his name is Leonard Wiseman. He smuggled illegal arms to some of these paramilitary groups in the Zionist movement. And then, again, a name that comes up a lot, gangster. They used Meyer Lansky and his ties to the longshoremen, Bayonne Joe Ziccarelli, to assist these shipments in illegal arms. So you kind of see this skirting of, for this now other Zionist movement that they're supporting, and the tension between the pro-Zionist movement and people say the anti-Zionist movement in Palestine, how they're trying to support the pro-Zionist movement by getting arms out to these groups like the WZO. Is there anything else that you found out from your reading about this situation and how this skirts back to organized crime?
I think, again, hopefully, we can help whoever wants to read this book again understand why this is important to Epstein. So if we go back to Jeffrey Epstein for a second, just to kind of say, well, why are we learning about this anyway? Well, why is Whitney Webb giving us this? Well, you have to understand that Ghislaine Maxwell, like I mentioned earlier, her father, Robert Maxwell, was an asset for Mossad. Mossad is Israel's intelligence agency.
Yeah.
He used his media operations in Britain to, again, feed certain stories, but he was also involved in other aspects of their different operations. So there's a tie between Israeli intelligence, CIA, U.S. intelligence working together in a lot of these different cases. So understanding some of the key players in the Zionist movement, because in case your audience is not too familiar with it, right, the Zionist movement was organized for the betterment of Jews that were being persecuted all throughout Western Europe. They came together trying to find a new homeland so the Jews would not be persecuted as outsiders in different nations all around Western Europe and the world. And they ultimately wanted to get Palestine as their homeland, or parts of Palestine, which ultimately over time, without getting too much into the weeds on that, that's a long story, but ultimately by the end of World War II, they are given parts of Palestine to be given as their homeland. But of course, there was this whole, how are you going to build this whole country out of, thin air? You have open opportunities for industry. And of course, the Zionists also, when they first came to Palestine, they were in conflict with the British, who were still overseeing Palestine. So they wanted to push the British out of Palestine, some of them. And then they also were getting into conflicts with the Arabs in the territory in the Middle East, in that area, who didn't want them there. Yeah. So they needed to get certain militias that they created. Mossad was well, not Mossad, I'm sorry. What was the name of the militia? Well, they started creating different militias. Those militias needed to be armed to fight.
Was this WZO? The one that I mentioned, or were you looking for something different? The one that I had mentioned was WZO, World Zionist Organization. Was this something different than that?
No, that was a legitimate organization that they were organized. These were different militias that began to come together in Palestine that were overseen by Zionists.
Yes. They supported that.
I'm sorry, the Haganah was one of them, which was a famous one that ultimately the Haganah becomes what is the Israeli military over time.
Oh, wow.
But they needed to be funded, right? They needed weapons. So you had guys like Meyer Lansky was from Poland. He was a Polish man who was persecuted in Poland and knew of the Holocaust. And he was very much a supporter of Zionism while also being a gangster in the United States. So he was a huge supporter of Zionism and was finding ways to get the Italian mob to help run guns into Israel to get into the hands of the Haganah. And the Zionists, finding ways to get funding and money to the early Israeli developments so they could start to create a nation.
Yeah.
So this is where this tie-in with organized crime begins to kind of connect in with Israel and the U.S. And years later, there would be ties with the Israeli intelligence with Ghislaine Maxwell's father, who ultimately some believe was one of the mentors to Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, wow. So you can kind of see these connections starting to form. Like, how do you get after certain interests that you're not getting public support for, or there's other world interest against the movements that you're trying to support? It's almost like you have to, it's a reoccurring theme. You have to figure it out on your own time, in your own way, how to make it happen. And a lot of times the way it's done is through militia groups and through organized crime and through dirty money and laundered money. It's almost seems like it's, one of the ways, like when in Rome, it almost seems like when you're an intelligence agency trying to battle world movements and, ideas and, Cold War politics, you figure out situations that you could, relationships, and you figure out groups that you need to support in order to get your objective, your primary objective, accomplished. And this is how this was being done. This was being done in ways, again, by supporting organized crime and gangsters and such, and people who had ties across the world. Getting into one of the key names of someone who kept coming up quite a bit. I believe the guy's name was Roy Cohn, and this was a lawyer who worked for liquor baron Rosenstiel, and at one point, even some claim, I don't know if there's any facts to get behind this, that this Roy Cohn is that he was involved sexually with the Baron Liquor Lou Rosenstiel. But Rosenstiel, if anybody doesn't know, made his riches during Prohibition based on a chance encounter with Winston Churchill, which is strange that in a chance encounter with Winston Churchill, basically Churchill pulled him aside and said, in the early 1920s, you should plan for the comeback of liquor. If you get behind this whole, I know it's Prohibition right now, I know it doesn't look good, but if you plan to really get behind the liquor industry, when it comes back, you'll have a strong footing in that in the commerce of legal liquor, and you'll be basically filthy rich. So this guy, Lou Rosenstiel, basically takes that advice from Churchill, and he actually, which is even, again, interesting, that he gets backing, even during the time of Prohibition, from elite banking institutions such as the Lehman Brothers. So after the Prohibition is repealed in 1933, because turned out to be kind of a big failure. It just gave a lot of power to organized crimes, and I think a lot of the above board people just realized that it wasn't working out that great when you got people like Al Capone, who are gangsters, and they have like 60 or 70% of the Chicago PD on his payroll. These guys are super powerful, and like liquor gave them that power, so they realized like this isn't working out for us so well. We might as well make liquor legal again and just tax the hell out of it, and make it like an above board thing, so we can start getting our cut and stop giving all these gangsters all this power. So this guy, Lou Rosenstiel, forms Schenley Distillers Company in 1933, and then he has relationships with business figures such as Meyer Lansky, Al Fusco, who was Al Capone's associate, Joe Lindsay, who worked with Kennedy's bootlegging operation. You had mentioned, I think, something about FDR's grandfather or something. You said he was in the opium operation. So if a lot of people don't know, John JFK's father, Joe Kennedy, was involved, got a lot of his money through the bootlegging operations. So Cohn worked as Joe McCarthy's chief counsel during the height of the Red Scare. So this is like just a foundation of who this guy is. And he's known for hosting sexual parties where young men would be used for sex by power elites at the Plaza Hotel's Blue Suite. Some of the people that have been alleged to have been attending these sexual parties with young men were Cardinal Spellman, J. Edgar Hoover, and they would often show up to these parties, say, like, dressed as women, and everybody would laugh when everybody knew who they were, but, in order to conceal their identities, they'd go to these sex parties. So, I guess these are just, I don't know if these are considered just allegations, or if these are, if you have a witness to something like that and they say something, you can say, oh, well, did it actually occur? Obviously, these are private parties, but this is who this guy Roy Cohn is, and he's, skirting with these high-level, powerful figures, and he's also skirting with, sex parties, and, I don't know if a lot of these situations turned into blackmail afterwards, but what's your comment on who this guy Roy Cohn is, and how he factors into maybe what we now see, or what we then saw with Jeffrey Epstein, and the sort of interworkings of that?
I would go back a little bit here on Roy Cohn, because he's a very interesting character. In fact, that some people have said that Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor.
Oh, okay.
So he's
Roy
had
Cohn. I'm sorry.
a huge impact all the way up to Donald Trump. But to go back to where Roy Cohn came out of, Roy Cohn comes out of New York City Democratic politics originally. His father was deeply in the Democratic political system. And then his son, Roy, becomes a lawyer, and he gets him involved representing in the Southern District of New York, being a prosecutor. He really makes his name if during the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg trial. And if people know about that, that was two individuals who were working as spies for the Soviet Union, and they were found out to be spies and were held on trial. So Roy Cohn was part of the prosecution team that put them, sent them. I think they were ultimately what would the term be?
Executed. They were executed by electrocution.
Yeah.
Yes, I recently read the book. I did the Audible version of Richard Rhodes. I read the first edition of The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and he did a second version, this really good book. I found the unabridged version, which was the long version. I just finished it like about 2 months ago, and it was all about the hydrogen bomb and all the Cold War politics of the hydrogen bomb, and part of that book circled right around the Rosenberg trial. And Julius Rosenberg was going to be put to death, and Ethel Rosenberg actually had the opportunity to basically just give dirt on her husband, Julius, and basically said, like, we'll spare your life. You don't have to die too. You could just get like life in jail. And she basically said, yeah, no, I'm good. She goes, now the last deed on this earth that I'll be seeing before my husband dies is giving my husband up to the authorities, when I guess they felt like they were doing a just thing, like as they basically were betraying the country with this espionage, and they gave her multiple chances to actually come clean and give all the information that she knew about her husband. And if she flipped on him, they would cut her a plea deal, and maybe spare her life and just give her life in imprisonment, or maybe even less. I don't know what they were offering her, but she goes, no, I won't have my kids know me as somebody who turned their back against their father. So I'd rather just die with him, So yeah, they both were put to death. I think that was somewhere in the early 1950s, like 53-ish. I forget the exact year, but yes, they were both put to death by electrocution.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, that's where Roy Cohn makes his name, right? And so this is during the Cold War, the Red Scare, and then you have Joseph McCarthy. We know about the McCarthy trials. Roy Cohn gets handpicked by Joseph McCarthy to help him in the McCarthy trials, to be on his team of lawyers to prosecute these different communists or supposed communists. So Roy Cohn has this background where he starts to get deeper and deeper into city politics. He moves up to the federal level as he works with McCarthy. And then over time, he continues to start really mingling and making contacts all throughout the major political figures. And so Roy Cohn comes out of that world. He mingled with J. Edgar Hoover, like you mentioned. This was a time, ironically, just on a side note, right, there was this constant fear going on during the Cold War that communists, let's say, secret communists that were in the U.S. as regular American citizens, were trying to blackmail American citizens. So there was something called the Lavender scandal, which the Lavender scandal was a fear amongst politicians and high-level Americans that undercover communists were trying to find different high-level people that were homosexual. Oh. And if they could, of course, at the time where being homosexual was considered to be a complete outcast.
Okay.
So they were trying to find different high-level people in our political system to blackmail and say, we've got pictures of you, we have evidence that you are homosexual, and if you don't do our bidding in Congress, we'll release this information. Wow. So that became part of the Cold War scare, that blackmail was being used to manipulate our Congress and politicians and so on.
Yeah.
So as a counterattack to that, it's believed that Hoover, guys like Roy Cohn, started to play the blackmail game as well, and were using certain sex parties and bugging different places as a way to get information on potential powerful people that they wanted to do their bidding.
For sure, yeah. You mentioned Cardinal Spellman. I forget, you're a cardinal. That's very, very high up there in the Catholic Church, right? Being a cardinal. I mean, that would be the Catholic Church, right? Being a cardinal. I don't know the history of Cardinal Spellman or who he was, but I mean, if he's attending parties with J. Edgar Hoover, that's the director of the FBI. I mean, and these are parties where allegedly, these Plaza Hotel blue suite parties. Young attractive men are being selected to go into side rooms in these parties and have sex with these powerful men. So that's what the allegations are with some of these blue suite parties, Plaza Hotels blue suite parties.
And
So
going back in to just to help the audience continue to see, like, why am I learning about this? Why is Whitney Webb telling me all about this when I want to learn about Jeffrey Epstein? Well, this blackmailing, this sort of blackmailing operations have a long history in covert operations, and it was used in organized crime too. Organized. Some people may remember the famous scene in The Godfather where there's this politician that won't help the Corleone family. So what they do is he wakes up, they drug him, and he wakes up next to a dead prostitute,
oh
and they happen to be there and say, "Well, we run this. You're lucky that we run this particular bordello,
yeah,
and if you want to get out of it, you're going to play ball like we told you to." So the
okay,
organized crime people also were known to have used blackmail to get out of powerful people what they wanted.
wow, look at
So,
that.
understanding this history is important to understanding what people believed Epstein was up to, that
Okay,
he was trying to set up blackmail situations for powerful people by having them on his island with underage girls, so
okay.
on, that could then be used against them.
Oh wow. So that definitely does lay that's a good explanation for how this does lay the groundwork. I mean, almost like, in a business model sense, like how or why,
Mm-hmm.
you might
Right.
have somebody like Epstein exactly set up in the intelligence world doing these things where to the public he's just some, corrupt person who happened to be some sleazeball, a corrupt businessman who happened to be, running this morally corrupt, high-profile prostitution ring on the very superficial surface, of this scandal of what people might know or might think they know. But if you start peeling the layers of the onion back, you can start to see this ain't the intelligence world or the organized crimes world's first time at the rodeo when it comes to blackmailing people for sex parties. This is kind of like something that this has been done before, and it seems to be an effective framework for how to coerce people and how to blackmail people behind closed doors, how to get what you want. Like, hey, you do what we say, or you're done, your life is over. And, you'll be basically politically, socially assassinated, and you'll never enjoy any of the same things that you once came to love in life. So that's where they get that leverage behind these sorts of situations where they can provide rich, powerful men their deepest sexual fantasies. They can do that. It's like the carrot at the end of the stick in a roundabout way. So just for reference, not getting into cardinal Spellman, but in the Catholic Church, a cardinal ranks directly below the Pope in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. So that's we can tell that's obviously the Pope is the figurehead of the Catholic Church. So when you start talking about cardinals, these are very, very high-ranking people, and especially in an organization like the Catholic Church. I mean, this is a very powerful world organization. So and moving forward a little bit, circling back around to different clubs or different organizations like the China Lobby. A group called the Georgetown Club comes about in 1966, and it's was officially established for the purpose of bringing world leaders or leaders together who had an impact on the United States and the world. And but in very many ways, this group circled back around with the same principles as the China Lobby, and one of the main figures was a man named Tuck Sung Park, who was a asset of the Korean CIA, and it was more than just on the surface of what they were saying, just a group of leaders, just social networking and lobbying groups. Apparently, this Georgetown Club again starts getting back into this eavesdropping and blackmailing. So maybe that was a covert objective of this Georgetown Club. one of the future Reagan national security advisors named Richard Allen suggested that the club was bugged. They put wires and they put I don't know if that was just cameras or just wires, but they were trying to get information, trying to set up trysts like we were just had talking about, with the Roy Cohen scandal, like the Lavender scandal, and how he was setting up these these Hotel Plaza Blue Suite parties. Maybe one of the dark secret agendas of the Georgetown Club was to, try to get these powerful elites again with the Georgetown Club to live out their deepest carnal fantasies in the flesh and then covertly fill them and blackmail them. And any more information I have would be the manager of the Georgetown Club was a man named Norman Larson. He previously worked for Washington office's Lifeline Foundation, and they supported right-wing causes. So they're going to be anti-communist. So any more ideas about the Georgetown Club and maybe what your thoughts are about publicly who they were claiming to be and what they actually were doing? Is this in line with what your thoughts were about this?
I mean, no, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, you might want to. I mean, you have members that were in the Georgetown Club that were CIA members. A lot. The name you might want to keep in mind. His name is Chenault. Is his last name. Him and his wife are big. Chenault was a CIA member, but he also he oversaw a airplane auto. A plane company that was used by the CIA as a front to be able to to help with bombings and assist with teaching like different militia groups in Southeast Asia who are fighting against communism. And what you start to see is that there's this question of and again, this is around the time of, well, a little bit after Eisenhower, but this is a little bit after Eisenhower, who warned about the military-industrial complex. So just to add one more element to this, a lot of these players that are former CIA start these independent companies that then they know are going to be needed by government in these different operations. So it's almost as if they need to continue these operations. They need the money to keep flowing in order to enrich them and the different kind of military type of companies that they end up running. Chenault is an example of that with his airplane company.
Okay.
So a lot of these guys in the Georgetown Club, they're doing all types of nefarious things with bugging and blackmail, but also a lot of their key members are guys who end up being part of the military industrial complex.
Okay.
And they're in this kind of network of people that know each other, of keeping the money flowing from Congress, finding other ways to keep money going, and keeping these different operations funded.
Okay. Excellent. So, yeah, I'm familiar with that speech. You said it was Eisenhower on his way out to warn the public of the military-industrial complex. And I know just from other topics pertaining to, stuff with top secret development of aircraft and such, one of the known things for anyone that starts peeling back the layers of the onion was that a long, long time ago, the military outsourced a lot of the work that was being done in top secret projects dealing with aerospace and anything to do with the Air Force and new technology, foreign technology, possibly extraterrestrial technology. They could not only get the better funding, they could also bypass certain channels of that they would have to with intelligence and being official, by just outsourcing the work to the military-industrial complex for back research. So it's been like a known thing that the private industry, in the aerospace industry, like you have like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Grumman, I believe. So these are like, big heavy hitters in the world of aerospace, and this is a known thing for decades that the Department of Defense has outsourced a lot of their work to the private industry, and it's the larger term for this entity that I guess was created when they started to do this was the military industrial complex, the military working hand in hand with industry and being able to, at the same time, it's been known, bypass certain levels of communication and officiality by, being able to privatize, and, if it's being done at a private corporation, they don't have to follow certain rules. They don't have to talk about certain things. It doesn't have to be reported to certain members of Congress. They could, sometimes some of the research is done through darker channels or, what they call the black budget. So this is definitely, interesting to kind of see like this skirts back around with, in order to get the job done, that you have these figures, like you said, that were useful during the days of the war, but now that they've gone into private industry, they're still, working for these common interests, these, we would say right-wing interests, this Georgetown Club, in order to, obviously still during the Cold War, 1966, to beat communism and to stymie the spread of communism across the planet, which was a big fear, and a lot of people think that, if you do the research on a couple of years before the assassination of JFK, November 22nd, 1963, his willingness to maybe be a little bit more open and work through secret channels with members who were a communist like Castro and try to like maybe build bridges instead of build walls. There was a problem. There was a problem with anybody who had any sort of dealings with anybody that was communism, because the biggest fear was that it was like a domino effect. One country would fall, and as soon as this, like, say, unpowerful, unknown third world country somewhere in Africa, I forget which country it was. Patrice Lumumba, or I forget the guy's name, but there was support from the CIA to overthrow these people in these smaller countries, because they thought, like, if this person, in order to rise to power, starts to support communism, and then he gets into power in this small country, or this small country that is not necessarily a threat to the United States, there will be this domino effect. So what they would do is they would secretly support the overthrow of these smaller, up and coming leaders of these smaller, less powerful countries, and they would say they would do this on secret channels, and that was to thwart the fear of the domino effect. Because once he goes, and then he starts to support communism in order to get his power that he needs, the country next to him might be like, oh, wait a second, this seems to be working out good for that guy. Maybe we should do it. And then, the next country, and then before you know it, the whole continent falls to communism. So that was the big fear. That was during the Red Scare, I think that was like the big fear of this domino effect, that if one small country fell, it might be the beginning of a much bigger problem. So at any cost, people who supported the right-wing cause and the anti-communist cause would, more than likely do whatever they had to do to make things happen, and, including, potentially assassinating presidents in order to get that job done. So moving past Georgetown, moving into the 1970s, one of the big political news stories of the 1970s still to this day, and I'm not sure how many people know much about it. I'm definitely not an expert on it, but it was the Watergate scandal of the 1970s, where just a very superficial explanation is that on June 17th, 1972, police were alerted that there was a break-in at is it the Watergate? Is that a hotel, or it's where the Democratic National Committee had their offices there at I think it was like a Watergate hotel, or offices, an office building, and they arrested 5 people, a man named James McCord, Frank Sturgis, and 3 Cuban exiles, Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, and Virgilio Gonzalez. And interestingly, when Martinez was arrested, he swallowed a key that he had with him to attempt to conceal it. And originally, I think maybe people were, I don't know what the original public feeling was, that it was just bad for the Reagan administration, right? It was, I'm sorry, the Nixon administration, right, during Watergate. This is why
Yes, these were guys working for Nixon.
Yeah, this is why Nixon had to ultimately resign, is because of Watergate. So this was really bad business. And ultimately, it just said, hey, you have members that are working for the Nixon administration breaking into burglarizing a building that where the Democratic National Committee has their offices. That's just super corrupt. What information are you trying to get? What are you trying to plant? Like, who knows? But are you trying to bug the offices, which they had evidence that there was a break-in that occurred before this June 17th, 1972, where they did bug the offices. So it's just bad for business. It's corrupt dealings, it's underboard sort of behavior, and ultimately it led to President Nixon having to step down from office because he was shamed. He had egg all over his face from having this happen. But the big question is, why exactly was this going on? And yes, it was soon found that there was a break-in before June 17th. Bugs had been placed in the office. McCord had set up a listening post across the street at a Howard Johnson motor lodge. So there's a bunch of theories about why Watergate. Like, what about this key? Like, why were they breaking? What was the end goal of them breaking into these offices? And I think a lot of people aren't necessarily 100% sure. They know it was a corrupt thing. They know Nixon had to resign. They know it was bad for that administration. But there's been a lot of theories thrown out there. One was just by Larry O'Brien stating they just were placing listening devices, so they can get an edge on their enemies. So whatever their competitors are, they want to outclass them. So they want to put a bug in their office to see what they're talking about. See how they could kind of use that information to leverage some sort of political wins against them. Secondly, another theory was that the DNC had illicit campaign contributions made by Castro to the DNC. These have remained unproven. So there's this mysterious key that Martinez swallowed. Turns out that key fit into one of the offices in the Watergate building, and it was under a woman named Maxine Wells. And then the book kind of gets into, maybe you'd be able to kind of flesh this out a little bit, that the long and short of it is that there's a theory going that in this office of Maxine Wells, a former stripper named Heidi Ricken, who turned into a madam who was running a prostitution ring. She dated organized crime members. She was very much immersed in the world of high-level organized crime members. She ran basically a call girl ring out of Watergate and an apartment complex called the Columbia. So they believe that calls were made to set up a lot of these trysts with members from her black book. We're getting into this whole black book thing again with like Epstein. Powerful members of people maybe connected in politics are using this call girl ring, and maybe this woman Maxine Wells, they're being set up through her office. They're making phone calls and dealings with this high-level call girl ring, and that's one of the strong theories that's out there about why the interest in this office of this woman named Maxine Wells, like what was known on the, from people in behind intelligence circles about what was going on at the Watergate Hotel, and what exactly do you know about this woman Maxine Wells and this key and this woman Heidi Ricken, and what sort of information has come out to kind of maybe support the theory that this was one of the likely causes of why Watergate, what exactly they were trying to get out of these break-ins?
I mean, to go back a little bit there on the Watergate, I think it's probably important for people to keep in mind that going back to what we're talking about with so one theory is that Nixon was set up by the intelligence agencies. That's one theory. And the reason that theory is put out there is, for one, Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who was one of his right-hand people in his staff, they wanted to ease tensions with China. They wanted to end this kind of, as well as with the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of fear amongst the Joint Chiefs of Staff and many other pro-Cold War aggressors that were in politics and in the military, that they did not want that. They didn't think that was in the best interest of the U.S., nor did they want that.
Okay.
So they wanted to undermine Nixon's presidency in some way to prevent him from being able to make that kind of peace deal possible.
Okay.
And so if you go into the weeds of it, part of these guys that break into the Watergate office, I believe at least one of them is a former former FBI guy. And then I think another one is a former CIA guy. So like a number of these guys are former CIA to begin with. And number two, that people say, people have analyzed, there was no reason for them to be there. There was nothing too valuable that Nixon could have gotten out of the information that was at the DNC office. I mean, the important info that he would have needed would have been to hear from the candidate directly, not from the DNC office. So it didn't make any sense from a lot of people's perspective why they were even there. And Nixon has claimed he didn't order for them to go in there, but they kind of went in on their own because they were trying to cut it off at the end, kind of take initiative without his direct okay. So that's one theory. Some people might say it's a bunch of nonsense, but that is one theory. Another theory, the one guy who breaks the Watergate scandal, the famous, what's his name? The famous
Deep Throat?
Journalist.
Is it Deep Throat? Is like that his nickname?
Well, not Deep Throat was the source, but the famous journalist that broke the story was.
I could look it up.
Oh, damn it. Why am I drawing it?
Who broke Watergate? Oh, I could look it up.
Bob Woodward. I'm sorry. So Bob Woodward,
yes,
who breaks this story that ultimately destroys Nixon, just happens to be a guy who was a former Navy intelligence officer who literally got into journalism, from my understanding, from what I remember reading, barely had his feet wet in the world of journalism, and yet he becomes the guy that breaks the biggest story in U.S. political history up until that time. And the question is, how it's just so coincidental that he's a former Navy intelligence officer who worked closely with other intelligence agencies. So that also goes into the theory that this was an intelligence operation to undermine Nixon and get him out of office. Very similar to what happened with JFK again, that they were challenging or bucking the system of trying to make peaceful connections with the Soviets and the communists, and kind of that deep state apparatus that's already in the Pentagon, that's already in the intelligence community, were against that. So we have to take this guy out one way or another.
Gotcha. So we can politically assassinate him. In the early 1960s, they decided there was no political assassination strong enough because JFK was well liked enough by certain members. They just thought he was too much of a threat. But and in this case now with Nixon, they're going to politically assassinate him by having something like this go awry on purpose. Basically set him up to get shot down.
And this becomes a pattern. I mean, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, or someone would want to go down this on their own, I mean, you see president after president Donald Trump, these presidents who are campaigning on pulling us out of war and pulling us out of this kind of interventionist approach to foreign policy, continue to either have assassination attempts on them, political assassinations, the Russia hoax. I mean, a lot of people believe, again, that was the intelligence community trying to destroy a potential president that will come in and change the foreign policy of what the Pentagon and the intelligence community wants. And this is how they do it. So, again, going into, there's this rogue, deep state that, undermines potentially our democracy, that undermines our foreign policy, and is playing, they're calling their shots as they want to see them. And that also goes to the military industrial complex. As long as we stay in war, we make a lot of other people rich.
Yep, that is true.
Our taxpayer money is going to pay for these weapons, are going to pay for all these other things that these different contractors that you were mentioning. Is their bread and butter.
Yeah. I thought it was very interesting. One perfect example of that. So we had this Iraq war, and it was originally Operation. It turned into Operation Enduring Freedom, but it was I think it was the first part of the Iraq War was what was it? First name. I'm just want to get it right. Iraq War in 2000. What was it? Four. Let's see. I think it was Operation Iraqi Freedom, or there was something before. Remember Shock and Awe that they wanted in 2003? And it was like,
Mm-hmm.
because they said weapons of mass destruction. That was the original tenet or premise to go into Iraq. And they're like, oh, these weapons of mass destruction, we got to hurry up and get these bad guys before they use these weapons of mass. Like, the word couldn't be used enough. So if we could get the American public, especially after 9/11, I mean, which was a horrible thing, you know, I'm actually doing one of looking into doing one of the charity runs coming up for first responders that was started from a firefighter who had died in 9/11. So 9/11, terrible thing, but the American public can get behind. Oh, these are the bad guys. They got these weapons of mass destruction. We got to go in there and smash them and shock and awe. And that's what they did in Fallujah. However many thousands and thousands of pounds of explosives they blew up over the city to show shock and awe, to show our power and might. And then afterwards, everybody was like, okay, shock and awe, okay, we got you, bad guys, shock and awe, weapons of mass destruction, okay, gotcha, following you. And then there was like a period where we go in, then we take the statue down, and there's videos all over the Fox News of everybody ripping the statue down with chains and putting a mask over the, like whatever, taking that big statue of Saddam Hussein. So we got the bad guy. We basically took Iraq within a X amount of time, and it was a big, huge success. And then we're like, okay, and let's get at those weapons of mass destruction. Then, like, where are they at now? Let's have them. Let's roll them on out. And there's just like crickets, and they're like, oh, this is not. We're actually moving into our next operation. This is Operation Enduring Freedom, where our main premise is to free the Iraqi people. And we're like, no. Like, what happened to the weapons of mass destruction? And it's just like, no, moving right along. We have our main goal here now is just to free. And it became a big deal for a lot of people. They're like, well, wait a second, what the hell happened? And then turns out that it was an intelligence glitch or an intelligence misintelligence. Hey, they didn't know at the time. Everyone's throwing their hands up and saying, hey, it wasn't me, it was this guy, it was that guy. And nobody actually was held accountable for the fact that these weapons were never found. And then, long and short of it was that Dick Cheney, at the time, I think he was at the time vice president under George Bush. He had a company called Halliburton, or had stake in a company called Halliburton, which was responsible for rebuilding Iraq after they smashed it. Now, if that's not a conflict of interest to have a politician who's a high-ranking politician to have a stake in a company that is sourced with billions of dollars of rebuilding a country that you just destroyed, you know what I'm saying? So, like, it kind of just made me think of that, like one is in bed with the other, and like there's money to be made. So somebody made money off of that. Somebody got filthy rich off of that, And,
Absolutely.
and the fact you have a politician who, starts a war, a high-ranking politician, under false pretenses, but still makes boatloads of money. Like, that's corruption, and at its very, very finest. And some people would even consider that evil. Like, how many people died in that war over a false premise for a war? I get Saddam Hussein wasn't a good person by our standards of morals, but I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people were killed and or murdered or maimed, or probably more than 200,000 or 300,000, probably somewhere in that number. Probably the amount of Iraqis that were killed in that war, and it was started under false premises, honestly. And then they never held anybody to task or held anybody accountable or called out, blew the flag or threw the red flag in and said, hey, wait a second, you started a war, fake premises, you made billions of dollars off rebuilding that war with your company. Like, wait a second, like, who's going to blow the whistle on this, So, and I don't think it ever was done. So it's kind of like what you're saying. Yeah, there's definitely money to be made from wars, for sure. And we've seen it again and again and again throughout history. Not like 100 years ago, but within the past 20 years, this was, So, circling back around to, again, coming out of Watergate, now, these intelligence agencies are under fire. They're under close scrutiny now because of Watergate. They don't really they don't really have the capability because they're such under the watchful eye now because of what was going on with Watergate and the possibility that there was more going on here and these break-ins and who was involved and what was involved. Their hands are kind of tied. So a club comes along called the Safari Club, and officially it was a meeting space for heads of numerous intelligence agencies that were allied with the United States in those increasingly heated days of the Cold War, per a quote from the book. So again, they took a quote from a man who was one of the organizers of the Safari Club about why. His name is Turki bin Faisal, who's the nephew of one of the organizers, Kamal Adam, who was the director of Saudi intelligence, of what this Safari Club is. And basically, due to the Watergate, the intelligence community now had its hands tied. So the Safari Club comes along again with these hopes of fighting communism. This reoccurring theme, and it was composed of members of high-powered members of people from France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Iran. And it was basically hoping to counter Soviet influence, and especially in Africa, the book cited, and one of the banks that was known to be all throughout this book. Again, we'll get into that with one of our points in a little bit shortly. Is the Bank of Credit and Commercial International, or BCCI, and it's known to be a very corrupt bank involved in a lot of money laundering and bribing. But do you have any comments about the Safari Club and what their role was in this connection? Maybe between, I don't know, I couldn't find much further between their connection between corruption and but using BCCI lets me know that was a bank that did have a lot of things going on, negative things going on in corruption. So the fact they were using that for offshore dark money from offshore finances lets you know something was at hand, because if you wanted to do everything above board, you wouldn't need to use a bank such as BCCI, correct, with the Safari Club?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's just another example of these kind of networks that they create, and these meeting groups that they create that become a hub for setting up these operations, kind of this underground sort of, almost this underground sort of government. Like they have their own black market government of how they're running things. And so, yeah, that does lead. BCCI, I would highly recommend anyone. Whitney Webb does a great job of kind of digging into what BCCI is. There's a whole chapter on it, but it's a fascinating story, a shocking story. And there's some really good documentaries that are, you can even get on YouTube. I was watching one. It's mind blowing what this big bank that comes out of this guy from, I believe, Pakistan, sets it up. He begins to put it together in Switzerland. Again, Switzerland is another country where there's like a lot of lax regulations on banking.
Yeah.
And it becomes this it becomes like the epicenter of money funneling from Saddam Hussein, from Gaddafi, from Iran, from organized crime. Every bad guy that you could put on a list was running money through BCCI. It was a complete fraud of a company that was basically money laundering, doing all that sort of thing for the worst types of folks. And the CIA was also using BCCI again to launder their money and to move and transfer money to different operations that they were trying to do covertly from the eyes of Congress and the American people. And then ultimately this company gets found out, and it becomes this massive scandal.
Yeah. Yes.
As you would imagine, that goes all the way. The biggest thing in the U.S. was that BCCI ends up infiltrates the American banking system, which people were shocked about, and was starting to have contacts and legitimate relations with American banking. So they start to look into who brought BCCI into the American banking system. You start finding that there's key people that are former CIA agents, high-ranking political people, and it's a much bigger web of conspiracy, and it interconnects also with money that was being transferred for the Iran-Contra scandal.
Okay.
So that topic I would highly recommend people to look into.
Yeah. So BCCI sounds like maybe in order to like launder the laundered money, they go to like launder the bank by then trying to hook the bank up with legitimate banks here in the United States. So when probes are launched into it, they can say, oh, well, this bank, who is a known legitimate institution, has dealings with BCCI. This is like ways to maybe counterbalance the argument. Like, this is only a sham bank. All they do is these corrupt funding and just some of the list of some of the things. By 1991, when this really started to come to light, it operated in over 70 countries and had 23 billion in assets, and it was more than likely set up and designed to evade regulatory oversights and illicit money and arms trafficking, all the things that we were talking about throughout this book. Just some of the key points that they were the reason for their corruption was they were able to evade regulation through all sorts of subsidiary shell corporations. They were able to evade a lot of regulation. They had fraudulent practices. Like you had stated, fictitious loans, hidden losses, stuff to deceive or inflate assets or make them look like they're inflated, cooking the books. So all sorts of that was going on. Money laundering, which we've been talking about, laundered money from criminals, and that's a key point that you brought up. Bribery. They bribed government officials. Leverage powerful connections from people, and there was really a lack, maybe because it was a global bank. Like, who oversees a global bank is the question. I know we have, like, I'm not sure, like we know, like in our country, like you have different organizations that oversee issues, regulatory commissions that are throughout the United States. But once you start getting to a global bank, what entity oversees global banks? So, like, if they're operating all throughout, is it each country has to oversee that branch of the bank? Is that how it works? Or, what if there's things that country can't see because there's, like you said, like this is an interglobal bank now, a corrupt interglobal bank. So I think the lack of oversight, intimidation witness, there's just all sorts of things. I think it ultimately collapsed in 1991 when this came to light that this bank was a massive fraud and there was lots of criminal activity. So everybody had decided that it's time to go. I think we pull our money out, and this bank is no good. This is not going to be good for business. So you had mentioned, you had kind of got into, and I'll kind of just give maybe like the key points, and maybe if you want to talk more about this, the Iran-Contra scandal happened during the 1980s. Some of the key points of the Iran-Contra scandal, it happened during the Reagan administration here in the United States. And it was basically, you could break it down into two areas. One was the secret arms sales to Iran. And we had a very public stance in the United States against negotiating with terrorists. I think we still do. Because if you start to negotiate with terrorists, they realize the dirtier they play and the eviler they get, the more leverage they could start to pull from a powerful country like the United States. If you just have a no stance policy, we are not going to negotiate. It's fruitless. You get more evil, get more crazy, do whatever you do. We're not going to consider you any more powerful to us the eviler that you get. And if we start doing that, we're going to start to say that, so the crazier you get and the more high-ranking people like you can kidnap and start saying you'll do this, or that, then all of a sudden, we have an Achilles heel. So you could start doing these things, these more, ramping up your efforts to do things that are more undermining, and that could get maybe people of higher political influence in, subjective situations, kidnapping and taking over certain areas of certain villages. And the more that we identify that as being something of an asset to us, the more we're going to work with you. And I think if you just have a no policy, like a stance of no policy, we're not going to negotiate. That's our public policy. But they were doing this. They were negotiating with terrorists. against Iran. They were secretly selling weapons to Iran in hopes of gaining releases of American hostages held by Iranian-backed groups in Lebanon. And then there was a second. This was like bifurcated. This Iran Contra scandal. The second tier of this was that, or the second stage part of this was illegal funding the Contras, and that's why it's the Iran Contra scandal. And then profits from these arms sales were then given to Contras rebels in Nicaragua, which were fighting against the leftist Sandinista government. And this violated something known as the Boland Amendment. And the corruption is obvious because of things I just mentioned. They're circumventing the law, violating the Boland Amendment. They're key members of the Reagan administration are lying, and Congress is complicit. Members of Congress are complicit in this deceiving and lying. The NSC was involved, which is the National Security Council. They knew about some of the stuff going on. And just basically overall, it represents an abuse of power. As an executive organization comes in and says, hey, you're going to do everything above board. You were sworn into this office and you're going to run things as it should be run. And then behind closed doors, you're doing these underboard or these considered morally questionable things against our policy, which makes us consider ourselves like the tenant of hope and freedom for the world. And then we say, hey, these are the tenets that we, it's like people live their lives like the Ten Commandments. Like one of the tenets that we live our country off of is that we do not we do not negotiate with terrorists. That's one of our tenets that we, because of the reasons I cited, or some of the reasons I cited. And then when you see behind closed doors, these are being violated. It violates the morality of the things that we stand on. And this was all exposed after the Contra shot down a plane carrying supplies. And then I forget exactly what the fallout of that was, if the pilot was taken alive or whatever, but somehow in that plane, this was the supplies given to the Contra as this whole thing was brought to light. And so what exactly, as far as the corruption goes, do you have anything more on, how this was set up or why this was set up? I really don't know much of a backstory. I'm just giving the facts of what Iran Contra scandal is. But as far as the backstory goes, I'm not super familiar with or how or why.
Well, you covered a lot of it. I mean, the biggest issue was for the CIA was that Congress had to say they are no longer funding any more of these proxy war operations, right? So people are not sure what a proxy war is. It's kind of what's going on. You could argue maybe a proxy war is what is when you have one country that's you have a country that's kind of in the middle of a civil war maybe, and you have, let's say, a capitalist country funding one group, and you have a communist country funding the other group in hopes that country will, the side they support will become aligned with their political beliefs.
Okay.
So the Congress had said, we're done. We're not funding any more of those. This is after Vietnam. This is after everything in Southeast Asia and all these different operations we've been involved in. So CIA was out of luck in terms of getting money in order to be able to fund the Sandinistas, to fund the folks that the Contras that were fighting to overthrow the communists in Nicaragua. The fear, same thing that happened in Southeast Asia. The fear supposedly was that you're seeing communism starting to spread in Latin America, South America, and it's moving its way. If you look at Nicaragua right on the map, it's getting closer to Mexico. And as soon as you get into Mexico, if communism makes its way there, then you literally have right at our border a communist nation, which is a direct threat to the U.S.
Yes.
So the CIA was, in the opinion, like the same thinking with, like you mentioned, like the fear of the domino theory, one country falls communist, it's going to follow. They wanted to support the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua to hopefully defeat the Sandinistas, and they didn't have money to do it. They didn't have Congress taxpayer money, so they had to come up with some other creative ways to do that. So what they did was they found ways to sell weapons to Iran and use, like you mentioned, use that money without having to let Congress know or the American people know, use that money to then funnel it over to the Contras.
Yes.
And it's not as simple as people, it's one thing I've learned about this is, saying that sounds simple, but that reality of like funneling money to one group bringing that money in a way that's not known by anybody else and goes under the radar to another group across the globe.
Yeah.
You need a lot of front companies. You need a lot of fake banks. That's where BCCI comes in. It was found that BCCI was used as a way of transferring money in the process of the Contra scandal, of like sending it over to the Contras and then sending it back to Iran. Like that was all they needed, that kind of a fake corrupt bank in order for their money to go under the radar of Congress, the American people. Because obviously the CIA is basically undermining the will of the American people by undermining Congress and our foreign policy. Yeah. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. They were, and it gets how they. Then the question becomes like, okay, where did they get the money? Where did they get the weapons? Where did they get the money to buy the weapons, et cetera, et cetera? And there's all sorts of splinter operations that they did to acquire the money that they couldn't get through taxpayer money.
Yes.
And that much of it was through illegal means. I mean, if we go back to the episode we did on the Franklin scandal, Larry King, lo and behold, if you look at his background, we talked about this. He was an intelligence. He worked in the intelligence agents as an agent in where? Southeast Asia. He comes back to the U.S., ends up working, and takes over this, failing, crumbling credit union, and within a few years, it becomes the most profitable credit union, in Middle America, out of nowhere. Yeah. So. Yeah. You see his ties to the intelligence community. You see how he never had to go to jail or faced any actual consequences for running this fake, this credit union that he ran like a Ponzi scheme.
They got him on something. They didn't get him on all the really evil stuff, which is child prostitution. I think they got him on something, but it was basically like, considering everything he did that we went over in the Franklin scandal, it was a slap on the wrist. I think I don't know how much of the 10 years he did.
He spent a day in jail, did he?
They tried to sentence him to 10 years. I think he got out early, and then he was, last I heard, like I said, we talked about this in the Franklin scandal, he was working at some car dealership down south, but I don't think he did 10 years. I'm not sure if he actually did 10 years, but they had to get him on something because he was just involved in so much. I mean, so much came to light. They're like, I think almost like the trade-off might have been like, hey, if you accept this whole thing about child prostitution, like the really bad stuff, like we'll figure that out. Like you're not going to get in any trouble for that, but you're going to have to go down for something. Like we can't, the public knows now, like, so I think they figured like, oh, hey, Larry King went down for the whole thing with tax evasion. They got him something for taxes in the bank, but it wasn't anything crazy. Like you said, considering all the bad he did.
It was minor.
All the bad he did.
But ultimately, just to not to digress too much, I'm just saying that just one example of how the CIA was trying to get money and to also launder money in order to fund the Contras. Some people have said that the Franklin Credit Union was used for that. As well as different. I mean, you could talk about the crack. We should down the road maybe do something on the crack epidemic in the U.S. and how that ties into the Iran Contra scandal, because the Contras were using, just like we saw in Southeast Asia, like we said at the beginning of this podcast, right? Like there's a blueprint. You support the militia group that you're trying to have overthrow your enemy, and you allow their organized crime and drugs to fund their operations. We saw that in Southeast Asia with the nationalists in China using opium. Yeah. Well, in Nicaragua, cocaine was the KMT. Was the drug that they were using to profit, and also used to pay for some of the weapons, right? The CIA helped them. It's argued, and there is some pretty convincing data out there to support it, but the CIA, or certain members of the CIA, were helping them get the cocaine and traffic it into the U.S.
Yeah, think about that.
And then the profits they made off the sale of the cocaine would then go back to the Contras to support buying weapons and all that.
Cocaine was a huge drug of recreation for the rich in the 1970s and 1980s, for sure. Yeah. And that was like, the whole thing with, that's probably like a different group that was getting in here, but like with everything in Colombia, but these countries in South America, that's where ultimately the drugs were coming from. So had to be some sort of Had to be some sort of connection. The fact that they were getting money off of that. If it was a way they were funding some of these operations through dirty money, like drugs would have been right on the table. If they're doing guns, why not drugs? And if they could ship some of that here to the U.S. and the rich business people want to do the coke anyway for a recreational drug, and they're getting the money back that way. It's funding some of these operations. Like, hey, we see from all the things that we've spoken about, they'll do what they have to do in order to get this money. One of the ways that you had mentioned, like different ways in which that they might have funded the Iran-Contra scandal, is, you had mentioned something about the Atlas dossier, which is described as a nebula of Belgian businessmen, politicians, and criminals that were involved in arms trafficking, diamond smuggling, drug running, and things of that nature. At the center of this nebula was this man named Felix Predzeborski, a businessman and a Belgian diplomat. So he was a Belgian diplomat, and he lived in Costa Rica. Where he had dual citizenship from Costa Rica and Belgium. But so there was I guess, some reports about the Atlas dossier, which mentioned this individual, Brzezinski, and various forms of corruption. And I guess one of the things that were mentioned was in 1978, the Italian police found drugs in a vehicle belonging to Costa Rican embassy with one of Brzezinski's employees at the wheel. So that same year, one of Brzezinski's close associates, who was also serving as a diplomat from Monaco to Costa Rica, was arrested for drug trafficking, and this was taken directly from the book. That this is who this nebula was and who this person Brzezinski was. And one of the comments made was that they believe that Brzezinski's one of his banks that he used for laundering were aiding in the Iran Gate, which was for the Contra affair. I guess they were calling that Iran Gate, what was going on in Iran, and then the Contra affair, what was going on, like you just had mentioned, the Sandinistas, the CIA supporting the against the leftist government. They were supporting the Contras against the Sandinistas, which was the leftist group that was supporting communism. So this is one, like I think the unless you can correct me on this, like the Atlas dossier and what they had talked about with this gentleman was probably one of the many angles that came to light of how this might have been funded. No?
Possibly one of many angles that were used. I mean, you're funding a war. It takes millions, if not billions of dollars to do it. And they had to get very creative on how they were going to do this. And they used all types of BCCI. They used potentially drug trafficking. They used this guy you just mentioned that goes in. And I would recommend anybody, because again, Whitney Webb does a nice job of kind of bringing this guy up, but it doesn't really hit home. Like, she might. How does she know this? And anyone, Google the Atlas dossier. You could just Google it, and it will come up. And it's a legit, document that was made by the police in, I believe, Belgium. Was it Belgium?
Yes.
Correct. I believe it's Belgium.
Correct.
And
Belgium. Yeah, that's who Brzezinski was. He was a Belgian diplomat, and he also had dual citizenship in Costa Rica since 1978. So yes, Belgium it would have been.
So there you go. And when you really see the actual legal document that was put together by the law enforcement in Belgium, it really hits home that this stuff is real. Like, this isn't like hearsay. This isn't kind of, there's rumor. There was definitely a very serious, investigation into this.
For sure.
And, so again, these types of folks, going back to why does this relate to Jeffrey Epstein? Because a guy like Epstein is potentially, based on what Whitney Webb finds in her second volume, but I'm guessing she finds that he's also someone that is able to help and move and transfer this kind of money, and to help these types of covert operations and funding and banking, and becomes a key asset to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, he
Not
becomes.
anybody has the context or the knowledge to
Yep.
do that.
Yep.
So
One of the dirty tools, as we've seen, that they're using in order to fund these sorts of operations. They get it where they can get it, and the people that can give them the money and that can get them the funds and can get them the blackmail, these are the people that they're going to go after. This is not, like I said, the first time at the rodeo for the intelligence community to use these sorts of ploys to get what they want in situations where they might not feel they're able to go public and ask for public funding for these operations. So just a couple key points. We're kind of wrapping up what, the main key points that you had mentioned in this book. This is kind of wrapping up. We kind of got into, well, I guess we could talk a little bit more about the Franklin scandal. We already kind of talked about it, but we can talk a little bit about Craig Spence and the Franklin scandal. But before that, one of the last big things, and I know there was a Netflix series on this. I actually watched it. I didn't necessarily take notes or anything. I just watched it within the past year or two. And I think you had mentioned that it was a good Netflix show. It was all about the octopus conspiracy or the octopus murders, and just a quick kind of summation of this, and then maybe you'd be able to kind of speak a little bit more about it and see how this might have been integrated in some of these situations where we talked about what the octopus conspiracy was, and then what basically it's known as the Inslaw affair. And Inslaw was I believe it was a software company that developed a software they named Promise, Promis, no E. That was the name of the software in 1971. So Inslaw is this company from Washington, D.C. They make this software. It was used throughout the Department of Justice in the 1980s. And some of the elements of what Promise was, it was a prosecutor's management information system. So it was used in the Department of Justice and was to help prosecutors track criminal cases efficiently. So it was some sort of a data network that helped prosecutors from different, maybe that weren't necessarily working hand in hand with each other, be able to efficiently get information from and to each other. And using this database, they were able to do that. It was very helpful. Some of the key points in here, I guess, that the DOJ later found out that there was some deceit or fraud going on with some of the software. Some of the misuse of this software might have been that they were purposely trying to get this disseminated to intelligence agencies and using it on a wider scale afterwards, after they realized it was a big success with the Department of Justice. And they would basically put like a hack in the Promise software where it would create like a backdoor, and like a silent backdoor for those who were using the software. They didn't know that when they installed this software in their systems, because it was so successful in other avenues like the Department of Justice, they started outsourcing this to use it with other countries and other different departments and other agencies. But then this hack in the system of Promise had a backdoor in there which would be unknown to the person taking the software. So if I'm company B, you're company A, you give me Promise software and I'm using it at my company B, now you're able to, or the CIA or whoever this intelligence aid is able to hack into my company now because I'm using this software and get information that you need silently. I don't even know that you're taking it from me or you're getting this information. So my encrypted or my normally protected database, which is integral to my operation, is now has this huge hole in there, and the CIA, the intelligence agency, is basically walking right through a back door, taking all my information from me. So, there was legal battles, over this in 1986. I guess Inslaw originally won a bankruptcy court ruling. So there was a lot of heat brought upon this software and maybe this corrupt way that it was being used. And there was a very public battle for Inslaw, and what they were doing. I don't know who was actually found guilty, but there was connections through this octopus conspiracy. I guess it was originally proposed by this freelance journalist named Danny Casolaro, who basically said that like this promise software was not just being used, obviously for the DOJ, but for other more nefarious purposes, like through the Iran-Contra controversy. It's saying that somehow Inslaw was connected to BCCI. This was connected to the Iran-Contra affair. And the Promise software was at the center of all of this. So I don't know how much more you know about the Promise software, and then ultimately one of the things that like caps the end of this whole conspiracy is that Danny Casolaro had some sort of a death that was originally claimed as suicide, but many are saying he died under suspicious circumstances because he was getting close to this connection of this Promise software and this what he dubbed as the octopus. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert on the octopus. I did watch the documentary and I tried to follow it. This is kind of like just basically a lattice work of what the Inslaw affair was and what this Promise software did. And I don't know, maybe you know more about exactly where this was being used, what governments that they outsourced this Promise software to, and where these backdoors were and who they were taking information from. But there's definitely something to be had there for sure, that this was a known fact that this Promise software was corrupted. And there was another one. I forget the guy's name. Michael Ricconchuto was somebody that went on the record for he's saying that he helped develop the Promise software, and he's the one that actually had a hand in saying that, like, yes, this backdoor in this software was made and it was being used through covert agencies and covert ways. And he's saying that I think Ricconchuto wound up doing a bunch of years in prison, for something. They got him on something. I forget exactly what it was for, but he's one of the developers of the Promise software. He's saying, so there's definitely a fact to this. This isn't something that this Promise software wasn't being used for corrupt purposes. So maybe you have something more to comment on that.
I mean, you covered the gist of it. I would, like you mentioned, highly recommend anybody who's interested in true crime, in political espionage, check out that octopus murder documentary. It's really well done, and this is a whole story within itself, and does a great job of really laying and illustrating this all out. The one thing that Whitney Webb adds to this story that you're not going to see in the documentary, at least I don't remember seeing much of it, that she does a nice job of, she shows that one of the big, I guess, salesmen of the Promise software, who was trying to get this software in the hands of all these different and just so it was, well, I'll say that in a sec. So was Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. So bringing this back to Epstein and kind of where does this relate? Because we're toward the end we're really like right at the end of the book at this point, if you're reading it. And she ends trying to build up a direction in the direction of Epstein. So you get a sense that volume 2 is taking over from there. So yeah, Robert Maxwell was involved in the distributing of the Promise software and getting it out to different people, particularly people like, let's say, because of this back door, which allowed other governments to hack into the system and see what those other governments were doing with it. Getting into the hands of, let's say, a Saddam Hussein who wants this, or hands of somebody that's one of your, enemies, whatever it might be. That's where that comes into play. So yeah, that's where it ties into starting to understand, like, as we get into Epstein in volume 2, I'm assuming, this is where Robert Maxwell pops up again, and how he's involved in like these major covert operations that have a lot to the CIA working in tandem with the Mossad, Israeli intelligence agency, because the hacker that I believe put the back door into the Promise system was an Israeli. Okay. So that's where the Promise system kind of gets a collaboration between the CIA and Mossad.
Got it.
And they're both kind of selling it out all over.
So do you think this Michael Riconosciuto, this purported computer expert who said that he's one of the people that modified, do you think he's just kind of just trying to get some airtime, or do you think that he could be a legit figure in seeing to it? It might not have just been him though, because you just say one computer expert might not have been responsible if this is a wider network of CIA trying to develop a software into something, or somebody in the intelligence community trying to develop a software with a backdoor, a silent backdoor, which is becoming maybe, I guess, a correct word for this would be a Trojan horse. This is becoming something like, hey, we come bearing gifts. We're an
Oh,
intelligence
right.
community. We're going to give you this gift of this software. It's great. You can do this, 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 and that. It works so well. You're going to streamline this and that. Or your everybody in your government. You're going to be able to track this and that. Hey, great idea. I don't know why you wouldn't want to use it, right? We use it. So jump on board. And then at the end of the day, it's all for being a Trojan horse. Because the untold part of that is this has this secret backdoor where, well, now that you're using this software for all your crucial government interplay and in these databases that you have so secret, we're able to actually get access to all of that now. So I don't know if you know anything about him. You're saying it wasn't an Israeli man that actually put the backdoor in there, and this guy Michael Riconosciuto claims that he was the one that helped do that.
He may have been part of doing it as well and selling it.
Okay.
They do a really good job in the documentary. He's a interesting but also suspect sort of guy. I mean, he was a genius, like to the point where like by middle school, I think he was working with like Nobel Prize winning physicists. Like he was brilliant, but unfortunately he went rogue and started to use his intelligence, because he was also very much into chemistry. He was using his intelligence to create drugs and methamphetamine.
Okay. And some Indian reservation, right? He got involved with some Indian. I remember I watched this documentary. There was like a suspicious death or something. There was something about a Indian reservation that they were using as like a grounds for something like this. Like I said, definitely worth checking out the Netflix series too.
Yeah, because he's interviewed. He's still right up into the very end. But even
in jail,
journalist that's doing the investigation, he says about Riconosciuto, he definitely knows, and he's telling you things that are true. But at the same time, you can tell just by talking to him, he's dealing with some serious like paranoid, perhaps schizophrenia, or just he's just lost his mind in some capacity. So you don't know with him what's the truth, what's not the truth, what he's not, if he's still in touch with reality from what happened to him.
These figures, there's if you when you look into this world of conspiracies, there's these figures that come forward, and they're very interesting people, but there's always like this huge question mark over their heads. There's another guy that it brings to mind. He's a man that mysteriously died in the mid 1990s, and he was in connection to this purported UFO joint UFO gray base out in the Southwest named Dulce. His name was Phil Schneider, a very interesting character, kind of a lightning rod type of character, very polarizing, but like stood up in front of a room, talked about this wild story about like his history of getting injured in this giant firefight, and yet he tries to back everything up. He's got the injuries on his hands. And then you start looking at this guy's life. I watched the whole documentary on him. It's just a very possibly telling some truth, but also kind of a flawed guy, flawed character, and it's just like when you start, and we saw that too again in the Franklin scandal with when we did our episode, I think it was episode 18, we had like Paul Bonacci, Alicia Owen, when they started to try to bring to light these victims of this Larry King child sex scandal. The first thing that they did is they tried to decredit them. Like, oh, well, Alicia Owen wrote some bad checks. She's in jail. She's a criminal. Paul Bonacci was 19 years old, touched a young boy's crotch when he was babysitting him. He's a criminal. How are you going to believe criminals? And you start seeing like these flawed people that more than likely were involved in these really bad situations, but yet because their character is tainted by the reality of being a human being, as none of us are perfect, but some people are struggling with more demons than not. But does that necessarily mean they're all BS? Not necessarily. So you have these characters throughout the world of like conspiracies that like these Phil Schneiders, these Michael Riconosciutos that like they knew stuff. And then at the same time, there was stuff that they said that was also found to be not true. But like then so people put like a red flag up. There was another guy in the world of UFO conspiracy. His name was he was a retired lieutenant colonel, I believe it was Corso. He claimed that he was involved in Roswell and he did all this back engineering from the technology at Roswell, and that's what created the computer age, lasers, Kevlar, computer chips. There was a lot of stuff. If you look at his history and his military record, that is real. It was a real man. He really served. He really served under very high-ranking people. So there was a lot of reason to believe what he was saying. Then there were other things that the man said that were found out not to be true. Maybe it was just because he was older and confused when he was writing the book. So there's a lot of like these characters that come up throughout the course of like conspiracies and such, like these type of like almost like they almost become kind of like folk heroes, like were they telling some truth?
Yeah.
Yes, but they were also telling some not truths, and they were also flawed characters, but like welcome to the reality of life. Sometimes you don't get the facts you want in the package that you expect they should be in, you got to pick apart these flawed characters in order to get at certain facts, and that's just the reality of dealing with these sorts of things,
And I've often heard that's a specific tactic that's done by intelligence agencies in order to cover their tracks, create disinformation, create chaos, and then it will help for the story or that potential informant to lose face and to lose the interest of the
yes
of the audience.
Correct. Muddy the waters. These characters, unfortunately, for the very keen mind, and like I said, like I've done my homework. I read a book on this guy Schneider, like this other instance, like this type of character, like these folk type of hero type of characters that like turn up dead and like like these weird situations that like are purported to be suicide, but the family members said they're not suicide. Like I've done a lot of homework on some of these individuals, and you start pulling up some facts, and you're like, wait a second. This guy sounds like he's telling the truth. He was a flawed person, and he was troubled, and he was dealing with this, and that. But there's a lot of stuff that did jive. There was some stuff that didn't jive, but sometimes there's reasons why things don't jive. People sometimes they embellish on stories. Sometimes they try to hide something about themselves to make themselves to cover up for certain people that they like in life or they care about. Like it's these, there's no perfect. Like when it comes to these deep conspiracy type of situations, there's no like. Rarely do you get like the perfect witness. That's just the guy that was all above board and telling the truth, and you're able to just fact check this guy and look. Oh, he went to this school. He said he did that, and he said he worked here. And a lot of times it becomes very cloudy, and I think ultimately, like you just hit the nail on the head, muddies the water. These characters ultimately muddy the water, and they leave that little bit of doubt above the head of a person who does everything above board and by the book. Like, hey. This guy was found out to be this, and this. Like right away, bunk. Like throw him out. That guy's just somebody that makes this whole conspiracy look like a conspiracy theory. Like from the people all the way on like the straight side. Like, yeah, this is why it's a conspiracy theory, because you have people like that and thrown into the mix. But from the intelligence side, it's like, well, if it wasn't for a person like this, it might look more not like a conspiracy theory, more like conspiracy fact. So maybe we need a guy like this to come forward. But like, especially when, like, in the examples I gave, some of these figures turn up dead and under suspicious circumstances, like the journalist Danny Casolaro, like I said, the other guy I was talking about, Phil Schneider, like these people did turn up dead under suspicious circumstances, and all these people they're just ruled out. Oh, it was a suicide. And then they start looking into the nature of death, and you're like, well, it's somewhat suspicious how this person died. It's not out and out a suicide. There's things that are under question here, and like, so it definitely muddies the water, the circumstances of these people's
without
death.
a doubt. I mean, there's multiple examples. I mean, I don't know too much about it, although, something I look into down the road, but there was the operation, the COINTELPRO operation from the 1960s and 70s, where the FBI and the CIA purposely went out of their way to put out or to slander, undermine, and take and neutralize, as they would say, political opponents of the U.S.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something you could look up, and that eventually came to light. There's Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA had influenced journalists, media outlets, had their own media outlets that they purposely used during the Cold War to push out information.
Yeah.
So this is what you're up against, right? So people have to read between the lines when you have, or I wouldn't say you have read between the lines and use your best judgment beyond just what and goes back to what you said at the beginning of this podcast, right? Like the name of your podcast, No Media. It's like
Not media, yeah.
when the media is often, what's the word, compromised and in bed with these same people who are trying to cover stuff up.
Yeah.
You're going to have a tough time getting the truth ever out to the
I mean, I
audience.
I know you're very open-minded. I know you have that mindset of an artist from my past dealings with you, and like I think it takes like a certain level of open-mindedness, and you're putting yourself out there almost kind of like an artist intellectually. If you fall between the lines, you realize that the lines kind of box you out of having to like entertain certain ideas. And, like you could even claim, like, for example, I don't make my money off of podcasting right now. I work full time as a police officer. I'm a civil servant. Like somehow I have a dog in the fight because I'm a civil servant. I work for the government. Like people don't realize it's a complicated world we live in. There's a lot of people that at the end of the day, we all have to make a living, So like just because you did this or did that doesn't necessarily mean you're bought and paid for. Like, I'm trying to just get at the bottom of, the main point. Like I said, to starting this, I don't take any money from anybody to do this. I spend more time and money on this podcast than I don't. And I know you're not getting any payoffs to do this. So it's like, this is just kind of like a free form of like intensive investigation or thought, at least, of subjects that are very confusing, very, very confusing, these subjects. And it's easy to read a book like this. One of the critiques is that, like I said at the beginning, you can't see the forest through the trees. There's so many trees, and there's so many. And then chapter 2 to chapter 7, and that, and this, and this acronym, and that acronym, and this one, and that one, and we mentioned this one before, and this name. If you knew none of this before, you might just be left like on the side of the road feeling confused after you've heard all this. So, like, I really appreciate your keen eye to be able to kind of sift through all this mountain of dense information and be able to pick out some key points to try to make some sense of it. Because I honestly was just listening to the audiobook of this, I was definitely confused. And I know certain sections I've had some dealings with in the past through my own research, but for the most part, like a lot of this is new to me, and it's easy to kind of just the average person might just be confused and not really even want to look into it further because they're confused. So maybe this hopefully will. You
got to be highly motivated to want to go into this. And I would even say, and credit, and obviously we both give massive credit to Whitney Webb, because even as complicated as it is, she does a really good job of laying out a very, very dense and complex story within, what could have been 20 different volumes. She does an overview, but to read this book, and that's why I would give it out of 10. I would probably give it like a 7.5 out of 10, only because if you're someone who has a background and has kind of already back knowledge of this world of true crime and covert worlds, this book would be for you, because you're going to make connections. You're going to have enough to go off of to like sift through all the complexity.
Not
but
for
I
novices.
would say that if you're a novice, this would not be the first book I would suggest you trying to dig into. Find something more. Find one subject of the 100 that he touches in here, and maybe begin to dig into that first.
Yes,
because otherwise you're going to just get overwhelmed, and you're not going to enjoy it, and you're probably going to be like, "This is." Wasting my time.
Just confused. And I'm like, I felt like a little bit like that. You definitely helped out with being able to pull out these key points, because it just let the folks know these are just key points of lots more information was involved in this book. These are just some key ideas of how the framework starts to get laid out. Maybe simplify this whole book a little bit into some key points and ideas. And again, very much credit to Whitney Webb for just doing such a thorough, intense job, having that sort of laser-like mind to be able to back up a lot of this. If you look at the reference section, there's probably hundreds. Each chapter probably has dozens and dozens of different points of reference. So and then when you start looking into these, like you said, a lot of these line up, and I know a little bit from the Franklin scandal, a lot of this does line up to be fact. Like she summed up a whole book that we read about the Franklin scandal. We did a whole episode on that, maybe in a little bit of a section of her book. So it's like, there's a lot of information. It's very dense. And on the plus side, hats off to somebody who would go this far into trying to prove the groundwork for what a lot of people do have an interest for. And I think the average American attention span and like such and that, the way that we're fed media, in the world of Twitter and the world of getting your message across on pictures and Instagrams and videos of TikTok, I think we've had a shortened attention span, just that the way we process and sell information and get information back and forth to each other. So to have this extremely dense book to come forward, hats off to somebody that's able to really dive into each one of these situations and lay this thick, network of groundwork out to say like, oh, well, how was it possible? And like, we're not going to get more than we already talked about into that, because that's not what that volume 1 dealt with. But for sure, it lays the groundwork for how there's a history with the intelligence community and organized crime and high-ranking politicians, and being able to use certain illicit and illegal activities to fund money and to get political coercion. There's definitely that has happened before, and we certainly went over it a lot. Last thing I just wanted to mention, just because we had it as a point, we didn't mention, we talked about the Franklin scandal. We talked about what that was, about how that basically came into this Franklin Credit Union, which was defrauded. It was basically like, turned out to look like a Ponzi scheme from the outside in. Like, this guy Lawrence King was just taking people's money, and he was just basically like living this lavish life of like, $15,000 couches being brought into the luxury suite of his 7th-story high-rise building through cranes, like living this life like a king off of basically what was like a Ponzi scheme, just taking people's money that were investing into his Franklin Credit Union. But there was a key figure in this, as this guy Lawrence King was running potentially this prostitution ring with children interstate outside of the credit union to make extra money. He was a shady figure, and there was a lot of bad things we talked about in the episode on Franklin. But to get into a character that we didn't talk about much was a guy named Craig Spence, which was just the last thing we'll talk about just very quickly, because we're pretty much wrapping it up here. We pretty much covered all the key points that you wanted to. But Craig Spence, there's allegations about this Franklin prostitution ring in Omaha, Nebraska in the late 1980s, 88. And the allegations attracted significant public interest. And eventually, the intelligence community, it looks like they shot this whole thing down and they labeled it a carefully crafted hoax. And I think that was basically covering up a much larger problem with this Franklin credit scandal. And this guy, Craig Spence, how he played into this whole scandal, that, he was originally came to prominence after there was a front page headline of the Washington Times, talking him as a major consumer of a homosexual escort. And I think, I forget where he made his money or what he was, if he was somebody involved in somehow this ring that Craig Spence dealt with in this prostitution ring, and key officials from the Reagan administration mentioned him by name, and maybe some of the connections he was making, probably using this what was it we said Lawrence King, Larry King, using that network of people. Craig Spence was maybe just another figure. I mean, do you know anything more about him and why he would have been somebody of great interest? It seems like he might have been the bridge between maybe using some of these prostitutes and then filtering them into the world of politics, like the Reagan administration, maybe people high up in the industry. There were people like Robert Wadman was a name called out as potentially being somebody who was partaking in these child prostitutes, but somehow Craig Spence was leveraging these. Was he leveraging these relationships between this either high level prostitution ring, that Lawrence King might have been operating?
Well, I would just add to that just to kind of, wrap it up with where the book is, that she's ending at a point where she starts making connections to an airline called EJA, is the acronym for it. And this airline happens to be the same airline that Larry King and Spence were running a lot of this their pedophilic blackmail ring.
Okay.
And it's also the same airline that, if you look at the cover of the book, if you end up buying the book, you'll see a picture of a guy called his last name's Wexman or Wexler.
Okay.
He's the owner of let me get this just so I get the name right. I don't want to get, but Wexner is the owner of the company, The Limited, Victoria's Secret. He's a very wealthy retail business giant, and he happened to be not only on the same airline. Now, this isn't a major airline. It's kind of like a private airline. I know certain people will use these jets and stuff through them.
Got it.
And it seemed to be a private airline that was being used by folks who had connections with the CIA or were up to nefarious sorts of things like Larry King and Spence.
Okay.
And so by coincidence, obviously not, you have Wexner who's using this airline, and Wexner was the main contact for Jeffrey Epstein. Everybody says Epstein's wealth and status starts with Wexner.
Oh, yeah.
This guy who's the head of this massive retail giant company.
Still alive.
So
He's still alive.
He ends the book.
Yeah.
Still alive. This is where she ends the book, and suddenly that's where we're left to go with this.
That's the connection. So there's that Spence connection, Larry King connection to Wexner, Leslie Herbert Wexner, currently worth $9.2 billion. He founded Bath and Body Works Incorporated, Wexner Foundation, Study Group, The Limited, Bath and Body Works, and you said he's got connections to Victoria's Secrets also. So, yeah, so this guy's a billionaire who's still alive.
Yeah.
He's 87 years old.
Billionaire.
Yep. So, and the fact that he
and
crosses
that's where
paths.
Epstein's wealth.
Okay. And that's how Craig Spence, and the fact that they were using these jets, and Craig Spence was basically to sum up, if you just Google Spence, he was a American journalist, lobbyist, and socialite. And then ultimately, I believe he had AIDS. He committed suicide. They went over this. Oh, I saw something. I think it was about the Franklin scandal. There was a movie about the Franklin scandal. I think you had recommended I watch that, and they did a section on Craig Spence and who he was. And he was a very interesting type
he
of
ends up dead in a hotel,
figure,
really mysteriously. Just like, whenever you see suicide, right, we now should know that that's usually a red flag that this was a hit job.
Yeah.
I mean, that journalist, I forget his name, who looked into the octopus murders.
Danny Casolaro, I believe that's his name.
Suicide, quote unquote, in a hotel while he's doing his further research into the story. Spence, hotel room.
Yep.
So, quote unquote, suicide.
Yep.
Jeffrey Epstein, suicide.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
so
yes.
This becomes a constant, repeated pattern of anybody that gets close to these stories, close to being a whistleblower, close to revealing it in the media, they end up dead by suicide.
Yeah, very, very. I helped one of my friends out. They run a podcast. One of my friends, my friend Matthew, runs a podcast called Murder Coaster. I did a little blurb on his 50th anniversary for his podcast, and I covered. He said, "Well, maybe an idea. Give me a quick little story. Maybe you have some connection to." And I said, "Well, I actually do have connection to." I talked about a quadruple homicide that happened up here that happened upstate in New York, in Orange County, in a town called Mount Hope, and the connection with the quadruple homicide I talked about. I did like a little 2-minute blurb or a minute blurb on this quadruple homicide. It was a drug deal gone bad, and the guy tries to get his money back. He was a corrupt cop named Nicholas Tartaglione. Nicholas Tartaglione was actually Jeffrey Epstein's cellmate. And when I looked into it, like a week before the murders, Tartaglione grabbed Epstein's neck, and he was like, "I just want to try something out." And Epstein was feared for his life against this guy, so they had to transfer Tartaglione out after he choked him. He said there was an incident, and Epstein actually had to go to get medical help. So there was this. I was like, "What is going on with that?" They put him in the same cell with this and this guy, and it crossed back to me because I knew I used to live down in Rockland County, and I knew one of the guys that went down. His name was Gerard Benderoff. He actually committed suicide up in Garnerville back in 2000, I forget, 14, 15, or 16. And he was a ex-New York City, then Haverstraw police officer. I met him one time, so I talked about how this kind of circled back around to I knew one of the guys, and then Tartaglione, I think he worked in a city that I used to work in as a police officer, which was Mount Vernon, and he transferred out to one of the Westchester police jobs. But then somehow, like this corrupt guy who was responsible for quadruple homicide ends up in the cell as Epstein. And a week before this guy dies, Tartaglione's like choking this guy out, like saying, "Hey, I gotta try something out. I want to do something." And he like Epstein gets injured, and then he also Epstein has to beg for security and get Tartaglione transferred out of his cell. He's a big guy, like a big guy that was involved in a steroid ring, so a big muscle building guy, bodybuilder, and like, like it just, and then all of a sudden, like the night of the morning or the day of the murder or the day of the suicide, the security camera footage just goes missing and like happens to be out like the entire jail. Like it just seems very, very suspicious about like how you said like how these people, who these suicides, and when you start looking into them, like, and this is just a little bit of tertiary and superficial information I know about what happened to Epstein. Like, it doesn't sound good. Like, if you start looking into it, and I heard the more you look into it, the more it starts to look like, whoa, like what exactly happened here? And like, I even have questions like, all right, well, what exactly happened between Tartaglione and Epstein? What was this incident that occurred a week before Epstein killed himself? Why Tartaglione was his cellmate, then got transferred out? Like, what was the situation with the whole choking? He put something around his neck, and then Epstein said, "I'm fear for my safety, so you have to get this guy transferred out." Like, what happened with that? Was there an investigation in that? Were there charges on that? Like, there's a lot of questions I would even have just on a very superficial level that I think if you start looking into deeper, it might start peeling back some more interesting facts about what happened to Epstein.
I think that's a potentially really good podcast.
I don't know. See, the thing is, I don't know, even like, let's say, for example, I don't think my connections in law enforcement, I don't think that could leverage me any information of what happened inside this jail. That would be like confidential book information that might be documented in a prison records there. I could look into what jail it was, what this incident was exactly. I know it was mentioned in a news article. I was able to find this incident. So something did happen between Tartaglione and Epstein about a week prior to his suicide, and he did something around his neck. He wrapped something around Epstein's neck, or he said he was going to do so. I forget exactly what it was, but it required the attention of medical attention, and then all of a sudden, Tartaglione got transferred out of his cell, and he was left alone. And then, like, that happened a week before this guy, purportedly kills himself. Like, I don't know. Like, that just seems like I don't know. Like, he definitely, you're talking about a guy that already went down for a quadruple homicide. I know one of the other guys. He used to go to my barbershop. A guy named Biggs that was involved in this quadruple homicide. He turned. He gave all the information up. So they said, well, we might give you the ability to get out in 20, 25 years so you could still see your grandkids grow up. I think he turned and flipped on the other guys. And then the third guy shot himself. So like Tartaglione basically went down for a quadruple homicide. This guy is never going to see light of day again. He definitely didn't get the death penalty, but I don't know what prison he's in, but you're talking about a person that has nothing to lose. They're never going to see light of day again. So like if you approached somebody like that and just said like, hey, like you have a family, you have kids, like we could see to it that somebody in your family's taken very well care of. We'll hook up a business or we'll do something. You just need to do us a favor. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not sure like how that would have factored in or how this guy, but it just doesn't look good. It looks like that definitely could be the type of person somebody in the intelligence community could leverage into getting some work done for them on the inside, and then having it make it look like a suicide. Especially like, why are these? Like look at the history of the surveillance camera footage, and then you could just roll back like 6 months. Like out of 6 months, like how many cameras worked functionally 24 hours a day, and then find out that like, all right, what's the percentage? What are the odds of that like one camera would glitch out? Like within 3 hours of like somebody committing suicide. But like, what are the odds of that? Can we get like a computer expert or security camera expert in here to testify against that? Like what? It just sounds it sounds sketchy. It sounds super sketchy. And that's not even having the information on the inside of like, all right, what exactly happened here? Let me see the track record of these surveillance cameras. Every camera in this whole jail. Let me see how often they function, who services them, and why a camera would just glitch out or shut down. Why it wouldn't be available. Why was it lost? What? Like, let's try to figure out like the percentage of something like this possibly happening. Who was working? Like, there just seems to be a lot of questions I would ask, but none of us had the access to that. It's kind of just like stuff we could speculate on. But like, it's just interesting. Like when I heard about it, like, whoa, like it definitely doesn't.
There's a lot there. Yeah.
It doesn't sound good. It definitely doesn't sound good. I don't know. Like I'm just kind of like saying like I'm a and like I said, I'm not a detective or anything, but I do work as a police officer. I do have to interview people for police complaints, and these would be questions I would just very superficially start asking and be like, okay, so how would we ask to get the answer to this? Or let's take this up one tier and then ask like who again, like because it doesn't sound good. It just doesn't sound good that like all of a sudden like that's like saying like I wasn't potentially involved in something and like you suddenly like look in my police department and like oh well we have records for the past 2 years, but like the books for like the shift that this guy worked like one day out of like freaking 750 days. All of a sudden, just like I don't know, like somebody lost them. I'm like, wow, like wouldn't that be convenient? That you know what I'm saying? It just doesn't look good.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So
which is why the country is up in arms about this, and like even the idea that this Jeffrey Epstein story is going to get. We've seen enough here. We're not releasing this or that, or we can't release this or that. People aren't accepting it, man. Like we clearly see there's a cover up here. We clearly see that there's a bigger story here that. It's about transparency. Some people are like, well, who cares anyway? It's about transparency. It's about a sense of trust with law enforcement, at the highest level, with, trust with our politicians. That's what it's about, so it's not even as much anymore about him and what he did, which was horrible. And those poor victims, of course.
Yeah.
But at this point, it's now like, okay, well, we're at a time where we're expecting transparency and we're trying to rebuild trust with our government and officials. So, dropping the ball on this is a much bigger deal than just like considering like some scumbag Jeffrey Epstein who liked younger girls.
Yeah. Yeah, like there might be something much bigger going on, and like how, and then exactly like how the nature of his death, and like who would have had vested interest in that, and then why, like lots of bigger questions start getting asked, and that's potentially going to be a problem for somebody, to the point where you could see if we're talking about the types of people that we're thinking big heavy hitters in politics and that like somebody could make some back deal payments and you're talking millions of dollars and hey shovel some money off to somebody, say hey listen man, your family, your kids like taken care of, just you never have to worry about anything again the rest of their lives. Like this has got to get handled, and people get killed for less, man. I'm telling you, I know I see this the crime stats of like upstate like where I live, and I see the sorts of reasons why people shoot and stab and rob each other not for much. And when we start talking about big sums of money, people do bad things for big sums of money. People do bad things for barely any sums of money. So it doesn't shock me at all, like that there would be some larger involvement. And maybe at some point we can get into this secondary book and the secondary volume of this book and look more into it. But, you certainly did an awesome job, man, of breaking this down for me and breaking it down for our audience. And hopefully they enjoy, minus having to sift through all this information themselves, some of the key points that we went over and how it relates back to just the lattice work or the groundwork that laid the foundation for how a figure like Jeffrey Epstein could have come about and more than likely did come about. So, the book is One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1, The Sordid Union Between Intelligence and Crime That Gave Rise to Jeffrey Epstein. Again, we spoke about the author Whitney Alyse Webb. Check it out. Thank you, Jesse, for coming on Not Media. Do you have any final talking points? We seem like we covered a whole lot today. I mean, we're looking at damn near 15 minutes shy of 3 hours that we spoke about this book, and we didn't even barely scratch the surface as far as a lot of other facts that were there. So it's crazy to think about that. We could have literally spent 2 or 3 times this at easily this amount of time. But like I explained to you before, even doing 2 hours and 45 minutes, it's hard to keep the attention of the general public for much more than this without people starting to get antsy and saying like, all right, I'm gonna have to break this podcast up into 2 or 3 different sittings.
I get it.
So I get it too, because I'm when I listen to some Joe Rogan episodes, sometimes I do that.
You live a busy life, man.
Yeah. Everybody's a busy bee. So everybody's. But is there anything else that you want to leave?
Man. Glad to be on it, and hopefully, I hope people. I think it's worth the check out. But again, like I said. If you're a novice, I shy away a little bit before you get a little bit more background. And even if you're someone who's well versed on it, it's a really good read. But be prepared to put your time in a little bit to really piece it out. But I think it's worth it. So.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's it, man.
Thank you very much. Hey, and until next time, maybe when we do the volume 2 of this, or some other idea, I'll certainly have you back on again at some point in the future. I certainly appreciate you coming on Not Media. Thank you for your expertise on this matter, and at least breaking this matter down on something that can be extremely confusing. So I certainly appreciate that. I hope everybody enjoyed. Everybody, stay well. Thank you. Bye. Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you everyone who has chosen a life of service. This is not just military, fire, police, and EMS, but also anyone who has taken their talents and passions and used them for the service and betterment of others and this world. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying until next time. This is your host, at Not Media, JP signing off. Stay well, everyone.